Part 1 of A Christmas Miscellany 2021. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various. Part 1. Christmas in Southern Seas. From Into the Frozen South, Shackleton Expedition, 1923, by James Marr. Just about now, too, there was a certain amount of merriment in the ship, owing to Carr being required to improve the accommodations below. It takes very little to arouse a laugh on shipboard, where stern hard work is the prevailing note, and we were grateful to our amateur carpenter for permitting us to laugh at his well-meant efforts, which, though rough and crude, suited the conditions. Despite the alterations that had been made at Rio, the down-below accommodation was still limited, and every man had to stow himself away in as small a space as was compatible with continued existence. If in a future state I am ever destined to become a sardine, I shall know that I've had good training in the art of close stowage. As the wind was coming away fair, and with a force that promised added speed, the foresail and staysail were taken in and the squaresail set. The promise was fulfilled, and now we romped along in an inspiring manner through a quickening sea that slapped happy little wavelets against our quarter, and through occasional wisps of spindrift aboard. In the main, the day was somewhat misty, and there was a heavy swell running, as though promising an increase of the wind, what Kipling calls the high-running swell before storm, gray, formless, enormous, and growing. It's astonishing to me how Kipling, himself no sailor, understands the sea so well. He seems to have got right down to the very inwardness of open water, and if he'd been a trained sailor, he couldn't understand the sea's mysteries and wonderments better than he does. The day of Christmas Eve broke to show us a moderate sea and a refreshing west-southwest wind. During the entire day this breeze increased, and with frequent squalls and a gloomy, lowering sky, and the wiseacres among us prognosticated bad weather. Of course, it is always safest to prophesy bad weather at sea, because you naturally make up your mind that it is coming, and prepare yourself for any emergency. And then, if it doesn't eventuate, you thank your lucky stars for continued good times. But on this occasion the portents proved correct. Before night a big sea was running, and the wind, from menacing whistle, increased to that deep, thunderous note of striving which indicates the nearness of a pukka storm. We began to ship water. Nothing to worry about, but still enough to drown out the dynamo, as a result of which catastrophe our lights were extinguished, and we were compelled to resort to the oil lamps by way of illumination. While shortening sail, one of the clews of the squaresail, carrying heavy block and shackle, whipped sharply across the deck and caught Carr a sickening blow in the face. He was literally clean knocked out, but contrived to come back to time, and with his hands to his face, and the blood flowing all too freely through his fingers, tried to carry on. But this wasn't to be permitted. He was sent below for the attention of the doctor, who diagnosed a broken nose. The doctor and his assistant worked assiduously to restore the unfortunate's nasal organ to its pristine beauty, but though they satisfied themselves, they failed to satisfy the sufferer, who did his best, in front of a mirror, to flatter his own mild vanity. He made such a poor attempt that the work had all to be done over again, and during the operation Hussey consoled him with impertinent remarks concerning the effect his face would have upon the women of England if he tampered with it any further. This was a funny Christmas Eve, however, far different from those of the past. To palliate our present uncomfortable conditions, we endeavored to create a vicarious atmosphere by remembering previous Christmases. Here were we, a congregation of desperate adventurers, collected from all the corners of the world, isolated for our sins in a little tossing ship that seemed pitifully small to engage with the massed forces of the southern seas. All of us separate entities, dependent upon our imaginations for recreation. We talked about Christmases past, and groaned in spirit when we reflected upon their glories, and then, as nothing was to be gained thereby, we went on to picture the ideal Christmas we would wish to spend. Opinions varied very considerably. Sentimentally, we mostly drew passionate sketches of snow-covered fields and church spires pointing upwards, and waits and skating and honest Christmas fare, carefully omitting, needless to say, the consequent inevitable indigestion. It is rather queer how the exile invariably pictures Christmas as a snow-smothered festival, whereas the average Christmas, according to my experience, is chiefly remarkable for its entire lack of snow. Anyhow, we all decided unanimously that the Christmas dinners of the past were to be mere shadows as compared with the Christmas dinners of tomorrow. For Mr. Rowett and his considerate wife had made their arrangements well in advance, and the ship was excellently well supplied with rich and luscious fare. Certain cases, carefully stowed and treated with exaggerated respect, were rumored to contain turkeys, hams, puddings, and all those ameliorations which go to make Christmas what it is. And on this note of gastronomical anticipation, we welcomed the day. Alas, alas, we builded our hopes on foundations of shifting sand. Christmas Day, down there in southern latitudes, where it was officially midsummer, dawned bleak and gray and threatening. The wind during the night had increased to a very good imitation of a real gale, and the ship was showing precisely what she could do in the way of uneasy motion. A cork could not have been more lively in the sea that was kicked up by the droning velocity of the unleashed winds. So far as I myself was concerned, a happening occurred that threatened to make me entirely indifferent to this Christmas Day, or indeed any others that might gladden the world. My job was to maintain a lookout on the bridge, the forecastle by this time being so constantly washed by whole water that the normal lookout position had become untenable. The officer of the watch sent me below for a tin of milk, wherewith to make more palatable his morning coffee, and off I started, full of zeal. Crossing the poop, I felt the Quest poise and quiver preparatory to taking one of her solar plexus disturbing pitches. A big, formidable, gray-bearded comber swung up out of the obscurity, gathering weight as it came. It towered high, growing, always growing. Then it fell, right atop of me, washed me clean off my feet, and promised to wash me overboard. But with a natural desire for a long life as well as a merry one, I clung to what became handiest, a bit of the covering board, and held on. Noisy water covered me. I felt myself drowning. But the ship kicked up her stern with a saucy irresponsibility, the water receded to the accompaniment of thunderous growls, and I continued to exist. But I was as nearly overboard as a toucher, and considering the sea that was running, it is doubtful if a boat could have been launched to the rescue. However, all's well that ends well, and the watch officer got his tin of milk in the long run. Let it be recorded here and now how wonderful a sea-boat the Quest is. I have probably mentioned the fact before, but it cannot be too strongly emphasized. She seemed designed to stand weather that would make the biggest Atlantic liner quail. Small and light, she rises triumphantly to the noisy crest of the biggest waves, and stares down in supreme scorn at the welter of disturbed water beneath her. Always she seems to be laughing, in her sleeve, at the clamorous immensity of the combers, as though deriding their efforts to overwhelm her. She is wonderful, a ship to be proud of, a ship to trust. She seems to look on the whole business as something of a game, and instead of shipping vast masses of destructive water as a bigger vessel would, dodges the big fellows, kicks them under her keel, and roars up splendidly to the foamy summits to twiddle her fingers at the Atlantic's worst. Of course, even the Quest shipped water, but not in sufficient quantities to tear away her bulwarks, stave in her hatches, and generally tear her timbers apart, as might well have happened in the case of a bigger ship. But what she gained in seaworthiness she atoned for in her liveliness. By breakfast time she was heaving herself about in an unimaginable fashion, so much so that it was impossible to keep anything on the table. Everything was thrown about, and the fiddles proved worthless as a safeguard, and for this reason the actual ceremonial of Christmas was wisely postponed. To cook a satisfactory meal was a problem beyond even the cook's skill and resourcefulness, although there is no doubt that Green was the hero of the day. He did his best, but when the kettle hits a man in the eye, and the soup pot empties itself into his waistcoat, and the stove thoughtfully discharges its hissing embers on his feet, and every now and then a wave slaps in and extinguishes the newly kindled fire, and the floor is swimming knee-deep in greasy brine, what can a man do that would not cause derision in the mind of a Parisian chef? The boss gave orders that the impossible was not to be attempted, and lacking turkeys and the kindred delights of Christmas, we satisfied ourselves with heroic sandwiches of bully beef and bread, eating them as best we could manage, stowed away in the alleyways for the most part, with our feet and bodies well braced for steadiness against the soul-stirring rolls of the ship to which we had entrusted our fortunes. Green, like the hero he was, unexpectedly provided us with piping hot cocoa, and considering how thoroughly drenched and chilled we were, for there was no shelter worth the name to be found, the steaming beverage was better to be desired than nectar and ambrosia and all the fabulous delights of the gods. What though its flavor was reminiscent of the bilges? It heartened us and stimulated us to a nicety, and we asked for nothing better. At least we might have asked, but with scant prospect of receiving. Notwithstanding all seafaring difficulties, Green determined that we should have some sort of a hot meal for dinner. A thick stew resulted, which we did not attempt to analyze too closely, but ate and were thankful for. Such as wished it were also served with a tot of grog, wherewith to drink the healths of the promoter of the expedition and his wife. And then we compared notes of Christmases past again, and discovered what a queerly assorted company we were. From Central Africa, Iceland, and Singapore, from New York, Harburg, and Lithuania, from Mauritius, Rio, and Cape Town, from London and Aberdeen, and seemingly all the cities of the world, we'd drifted towards this restless speck, now wallowing in the run of a South Atlantic sea, as a witness that the call of adventure can never overpass the wildest limits of the world. And that all things might be finished in real slapdash style, a big sea, lolloped aboard, insinuated itself down the after companion, and saturated my bunk. Truly a merry, merry Christmas, but what of it? And this Christmas Day brought us many greetings, if not from absent friends, at least from the birds of the air, which were about us in great numbers, albatross, mollymawks, whalebirds, Cape pigeons. Their name was Legion. Boxing Day brought an improvement in our conditions. The wind was lessening, although the sea still ran high, and with only our fore and after set, we logged an even 6 knots, which was to us almost a racing pace. As an offset to improved circumstances outboard, we developed inboard defects again, and the chief of these promised to be really serious, for our main freshwater tank sprang a leak, and before it was discovered the tank was dry, and our precious store of drinking water was washing nastily about the odoriferous bilges. The boss took this accident very much to heart. It seemed as though ill fortune had dogged him throughout the voyage, but all the worrying in the world could not mend matters, and the only thing to do was to practice the most rigid economy in using what little fresh water still remained, reserving it for drinking and cooking only, endeavoring to satisfy all our other needs with sea water, pure and simple, though a little oily water was being distilled from the engine-room exhaust tank. Fortunately, the weather was growing considerably cooler, and our thirsts were slaked automatically. Next day, though the wind was still blowing fairly hard, it was fair, and we set the squaresail to take full advantage of it. No luck! Hardly was it set than the outhaul carried away, and down came the canvas for repair, which was effected with commendable swiftness, so that by breakfast time the sail was again set, and in obedience to the weight of wind in it, the Quest began to romp along like a cup winner. The number of albatrosses accompanying us now was growing. They are wonderful birds, and well worth watching. Gigantic, too, some of them are, with a stretch of wings somewhere about 14 feet, and an ability to fly untiringly without any perceptible exertion. As the day progressed, the wind freshened, and by 4 bells in the middle watch, a full gale from the west-northwest was rioting about us. Coming on deck at this time, I was greeted with the awe-inspiring sight of a favoring gale, with big seas galloping in our wake like hungry monsters eager to overtake and devour us. Dark though the night was, the phosphorescent gleam of the foam was so vivid as to give one a fine impression of the elemental tumult that raged outboard. The seas were being kicked up with truly astonishing velocity, and the hissing rumble of them as they piled along our rails was a sound to remember for many a long day. As the wind was well away on the quarter, the engines were unnecessary, so under squaresail and topsail alone, the Quest flashed merrily southward. We were logging a steady 9 knots by this time, better than we'd ever done before, even with engines working and all sail set. A mightily invigorating sensation it was, I must admit. End of Part 1. Part 2 of A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, In the Christmas Woods, by Adeline Knapp, 1899. Rain up the mountain. Along the serried slopes a white shape creeps, through oak-fringed canyon ways and up the steeps, a mystery of silent shrouding deeps, like spirit touching earth while nature sleeps. It stirs beneath the laurels, stirs within the redwood circling shade, and light and thin, where the brown tui builds and spiders spin, shuts the twist manzanitas tangle in. With swaying tops and quivering leaves adart, held for a while within the mist's white heart, like shadowy travelers ready to depart, tall wavering shapes of eucalyptus start. From far below, where level spreads the plain, travelling with jeweled feet the hastening grain, touching the slumbering hills to life again, marching along the summits, comes the rain. Of beauty. We ought to observe that even the things that follow after the things which are produced according to nature contain something pleasing and attractive. The ears of corn bending down, and the lion's eyebrows, and the foam which flows from the mouth of wild boars, and many other things, though they are far from being beautiful if a man should examine them severally, still, because they are consequent upon the things which are formed by nature, help to adorn them, and they please the mind. So that if a man should have a feeling and deeper insight with respect to the things which are produced in the universe, there is hardly one of those which follow by way of consequence, which will not seem to him to be in a manner disposed so as to give pleasure, and in an old woman and an old man he will be able to see a certain maturity and comeliness, and the attractive beauty of young persons he will be able to look upon with chaste eyes, who has become truly familiar with nature and her works. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. In the Christmas Woods. When nature decides that her Christmas gift to us shall be a rainstorm, she does not send any niggardly shower. It is raining in earnest, not the swift, drenching downpour of earlier winter that washes the earth of its summer garb of dust, nor the small rain upon the tender grass of springtime, but a steady, penetrating descent of water from a leaden-gray sky, with the wind in the south. It is good for all day. My farmer neighbor cocks a shrewd eye skywards, and says it is raining $20 gold pieces, and he ought to know. From my window I watch the beneficent downpour, and think of the white, feathery snowflakes that, in my Eastern home, always made Christmas Day seem to me so much more the Orthodox festival than rain can possibly do. Yet it may have rained on that first Christmas Day, when hope was born into the world. It could not have been snowing, nor could the rainstorm, if there was one, have been more inviting than this one seems. The drops chasing one another down the outside of the pane strike the glass with a little musical tinkle that summons me abroad. It may not be prudent to venture, but it is a good thing, at times, not to be wise enough to keep indoors when it rains, and I find myself longing to go forth and take my share of nature's beautiful Christmas gift. A happy thought that. I am quick to act upon it, and soon go tramping through the rain, eager to learn how my friends of wood and canyon are enjoying their wet Christmas. The birds, I find, have fled to the thickest shelter they can find, the redwoods in the canyon. They have no pockets, and no use, even, for aqueous $20 pieces, so they summon what philosophy they can to tide them over the storm. Swinging down a slippery trail, I catch an overhanging bough to save myself from a fall, and incidentally disturb a feathered congregation that has taken refuge in this particular tree. I shake the branch, and the birds rush out. The rain is sheeting down from the strip of sky just visible between the towering hills, and the startled flock fly heavily, with many a chirping protest, to another tree, where they perch and huddle again. A solitary brown tui, sleek and trim, is pecking about in the soft leaf mold, with the air of mackintoshed and overshoed comfort that this bird always wears in a storm. The little creature has somehow learned the secret of unfailing contentment. He reminds me, when I see him under the adverse circumstances, of that other object lesson in cheerfulness, the wee pimpernel, sunny-faced Anagalus, growing so bravely about the hills. In very early springtime, when everything is green and lusty after the winter rains, the pimpernel holds up its head for its share of the good things of plant life, everywhere abounding. But when the other flowers and weeds have had their day, when even the burr-clover has ripened and fallen, on the dry hilltops, in the bare meadows, where the burnt earth shows great cracks made by the hot sun, the pimpernel still blossoms cheerily, a picture of humble happiness. The brown tui is the plainest of our birds. He is not graceful, he cannot sing, he has only the charm of brisk cheeriness, unfailing, gentle acceptance of sunshine or cloud, as each comes to recommend him to us, but he is always a welcome sight about garden or hedge. I am interested to note the effects of the storm in the canyons. Here flows a swift, deep stream, always cold and usually clear. Evidently the wind has been at work, for across the creek, its spreading arms lifted as in appeal against its fate, a great alder lies, broken square off, some 6 feet from its base. As I approach, I hear the sharp tap-tap of a woodpecker's horny axe, and see the bird fly away. A good carpenter he, by his chips. He has thrown down a considerable pile of clean-cut bits of the hard yellow wood. They look as though they had been cut by a tiny broadaxe. Crawling under the fallen tree, I advance along the bank, but soon find my progress barred by a landslide. The softened earth above has given way, to slip down into the deep cut. Nothing but bedrock is left, and the bare gray bones of the mountain glisten, wet with the driving rain. The sight awakens both awe and pity. I am glad to see how the mosses are hastening to clothe the rocks again. Tiny spikes of the horsetail are already growing, where, I am sure, horsetail has not grown for generations. I climb on through the exposed roots of an immense redwood stump, a relic of the forest primeval, driving a wood rat scampering from his haunts as I do so, and come out on a slope of soft leaf mold. Here the broad green leaves of the trillium are already above ground, the buds beginning to show a small green spike. The Solomon seal is peeping up to give Christmas greeting, but everything is wet. The trillium lies prostrate, its leaves on the ground. Blackberry, huckleberry, and wild currant are soaked and wind-blown. The redwoods droop and drip, with here and there a branch broken by its own wet weight. Nevertheless, the scene is not cheerless. There is so much of hope in the quiescent greenery, and the fresh, wet scent of the earth is full of promise. It is surprising how much rain finds its way into the canyon. It might be supposed that such a narrow cleft between two lines of high hills would escape notice, but the water pours in from above. It sweeps through on the searching wind. It flows down the wooded banks from the hilltops, and the little stream becomes a river. The rain whips and patters and plays musically among the trees, and roars along with the creek until everything is wetter than the proverbial drowned rat. But it does not make mud puddles. It does not bring the same dirt and discomfort in its wake that it does where man makes his abode. The soft, fragrant brown mold receives it gladly. The mosses soak it up. The trees catch it in their outstretched hands and turn it gently down upon their own thirsty roots. The broad-leaved plants lie down before it and arise, refreshed, when it has passed. It comes, the rain from heaven, as cleaner and life-giver, and even I, soaked by its downpour, bewildered by the rush and sweep of wind and storm, touched by a little mortal fear at the strangeness of it all, am the better for such a wedding. Let but a single sunbeam sift through the branches, and the woods will smile like a happy child after its bath. Scrambling up the side of a moss-grown rock, I come face to face, on the top, with a huge snail. To my great surprise, I get a glimpse of a queer, dog-like visage, with snub nose and bright eyes. Then the creature pulls its soft, shelly hood down over its head, and I can see only its round, resolute-looking shoulders. I poke it in the back, but it only hunches itself together and rolls over. I cannot get another peep at its head. That passing glimpse of the sturdy bulldog face, however, helps me understand the persistence with which, once they are started, these creatures travel forward. One, crossing my dooryard not long ago, found its way barred by the house. Nothing daunted, he mounted the steps, traversed the platform, and started upward. He left a long silvery trail on the screen door and gained the wall. I watched him crawl past the eaves to the roof, and I have no doubt but that, in the course of time, he came down on the other side. Another of the same tribe I once found halted at the edge of a stream a few feet wide. I pushed him out on a chip and ferried him over, whereupon he started up the bank without a backward glance at me, who had so opportunely played Providence for him. The rain must have slackened somewhat up above. There is less beating in, but the creek still roars turbulently. I have reached, in my clambering progress, a place where the water tosses itself joyfully over a great rock to fall into a deep, wide pool, so dark and so still that even the tumult of the storm seems hardly to have reached it. It is dim and green and quiet here, for the sunlight never penetrates to this spot. The tops of the hills seem almost to meet, 200 feet above our heads, and the redwood growth is dense. The air is heavy with damp, woodsy fragrance, and the water is almost black. We talk of Mother Earth, but we might, with even more truth, speak of Mother Water, for every evidence today is that the first life appeared not from the soil, but nurtured in the broad breast of Mother Sea, even ere land had pushed its way up from ocean's depths. The green scum on the surface of still pools, the slime moles covering moist bottoms, furnish us with some indication of what this primordial vegetation was like. But by what long process of evolution has come from that common ancestor the miniature forests of the mosses on yonder rocks, the ferns clothing the banks, the wild begonia here at my feet, the osiers yonder in the stream, the towering redwoods themselves, who can tell? The story is our story. Only here and there, however, are we able to read a line, a paragraph, never a full page of the wonderful tale. But if it be not true that the same life which is in us is also in kind throughout all nature, then I see no reason why human beings should take any interest in nature, or feel any sympathy with her processes. But the very possibility of our taking interest in the life of nature, of our feeling true sympathy with it, is evidence of our unity with the least of her creatures. We may not wrest from nature all her secrets, but we cannot go to her in simplicity of spirit and come away empty-hearted. That which baffles us but increases our love, for something of her teaching lies hidden even in the mystery. The same love that brought the Christ child to earth is in the woods today, informing it with beneficent purpose for our strengthening and teaching. A very wise man once told me that all life comes from protoplasm, and that if we but knew the conditions, we could make the protoplasm. Not a bad idea, that. But if some day we should stumble upon the conditions, make the protoplasm, set it a-going, and exploit it in the newspapers, we may be sure that there would come a day when the wonder would again be beyond our comprehension. Life itself is a greater mystery than its causation. If we could understand even such a comparatively small matter as a bird's way of looking at life, how much of marvel would clear itself in our minds! We cannot understand even that, however. We can only, after all, love and reverence the things of nature as they seem to us good and helpful, and come into the use through recognition of the beauty. They are facts as we ourselves are facts, and in reality we understand them about equally well as we understand our own hearts and lives. A wee humming-bird flew about my head yesterday, poised on swift wings directly before my face, and I looked into his bright, fearless eyes. I do not know what he thought of me, but neither do I know really what I thought of him. Our lives touched for the brief instant of that glance, and through him came to me a thought of human love. I was better for the encounter, and I do not think that he was worse. Here, where the earth has slid away from the roots of a great redwood stump, I have found a long, creeping rootstock of the Solomon seal, which no less than 10 round, seal-like impressions left by past shoots. At some time in its growth the plant encountered an obstacle in the shape of a strong, outstretching arm of redwood root. The tender growth, striking against this, from beneath, was turned backward and downward, until, feeling its way cautiously in the dark, it traveled around the big root, and striking upward, sent out a joyful shoot to greet the sun. How long it must have taken the rootstock to do this we cannot surmise, but I suppose that, could we watch these underground happenings, we should find this sort of thing occurring frequently. We should not, however, be likely to discover the real secret of the plant's growth, its branchlets toward the sun, its roots downward in search of water. We only know that neither root nor flower has any choice but to turn toward that which is its good. The necessity to growth, of obedience to the laws of good, is everywhere the most inexorable of nature's teachings. The plants, guided by instinct, make no mistake in following the good. Higher in the scale, where a measure of reason is added to instinct, as in the case of the birds, we find the possibility of error appearing, and mistakes in judgment are not infrequent among these. Only in man, however, do we find the power to retrieve mistakes, consciously and voluntarily to retrace the wrong course and begin anew, and only with man does the perilous power exist to choose between following the good and turning from it. The rain has fairly ceased now. The birds have begun to stir among the trees, hopping from branch to branch, shaking themselves and ruffling out their wet feathers. They keep up a sort of indefinite chatter among themselves the while, commenting, it may be, on the probable good that will accrue from the generous Christmas wedding. Coming up the trail toward daylight, for it has grown dark in the canyon, I meet a flock of quail, beautiful creatures that survey me fearlessly as I pass. I hope no Christmas pot hunter will find them and carry them home, a trophy of his day's sport. How any human being who has ever seen a flock of quail in all their living, alert beauty can take pleasure in picking the poor little bones of the slaughtered birds is another of the mysterious things of life. I came some time ago with a party of trampers to an open space amid the chaparral, on the crest of a chain of hills. Suddenly the leader of our group motioned silence, and stood, with parted lips and smiling, delighted eyes, gazing at a flock of quail quietly making their way through the grass, with glossy feathers stirring in the breeze, and crested heads held fearlessly high. "Did you ever see anything more beautiful?" whispered their discoverer. But the Nimrod of the party wrung his weaponless hands and wailed, "What a shot! Oh, what a shot!" Verily, that first man went down to his house justified rather than the other. End of Part 2. Part 3 of A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Christmas, from The Open Polar Sea, 1867, by Isaac Israel Hayes. Effects of Darkness. And thus we jog on toward the spring, but each hour of the darkness grows a little longer, and soaks a little more color from the blood, and takes a little more from the elasticity of the step, and adds a little more to the lengthening face, and checks little by little the cheerful laugh and the merry jest that come from the hold and cabin. And without being willing to confess it openly, yet we are all forced to acknowledge to ourselves that the enemy does now and then get the better of us, and that we have often to renew the resolution. The novelty of our life is exhausted, and the outside world has nothing new. The moonlight comes and goes again, and the light glistens clear and cold over the white landscape, and the memory returns unbidden to other days that are fled and gone, and we miss in the sparkling air and the still hour of the winter night the jingling bells and the sleigh which will always hold one more, and the wayside inn, and the smoking supper that mine host serves up, and the crackling blaze of country logs. And then, when we forget the moon, and the snow, and the frost, and recall the summer and the sunshine, we remember that the seat in the shade of the hawthorn bush is far away. December 24th, Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve! What happy memories are recalled by the mention of that name! How much of youthful promise it brings back to the weary mind and to the aching heart! How potent is the charm! How magical the influence! A beam of light has fallen within this little ice-bound vessel, and from the promised morn we catch the same inspiration that has come to all mankind since that bright and lovely star first rose to the shepherds of Judea. For wherever we are on this wide, wide world, we find in the day the symbol which binds us all to one cherished hope. Gladness springs into being with the rising sun, and the Christmas bells, sending their merry voices on the wings of the returning light, encircle the earth in one continuous peal. Their chimes ring out glad tidings everywhere. The joyous music rejoices the lone watcher on the sea, and the hunter who warms himself beside the embers of his smouldering fire. It penetrates the humble cabin of the slave and the hut of the weary immigrant. It reaches the wanderer on the steppes of Tartary, and the savage in the forest. It consoles the poor and the sorrowing, and the rich and the powerful, and to the sick and to the well alike, wherever they may be under the sun, it brings a blessed brightness, and it gleams, too, on the eternal snows beneath the polar star, and with a radiant cross it lights the southern deep afar, and Christmas morn is but the dawn, the herald of a day that circles in its boundless love, no winter, no decay. I have never seen the ship so bright and cheerful. Sundry boxes have been produced from out-of-the-way corners, and from the magical manner of their appearance one might think that Santa Claus had charged himself with a special mission to this little world, before he had begun to fill the shoes and stockings, and to give marriage portions to destitute maidens in the dear old lands where he is patron of the Kris-Kringle Eve, and where the silver cord binding the affections is freshened once a year with the Christmas offering. The cabin table fairly groans under a mass of holiday fare, kindly mementos from those who are talking about us to-night around the family fireside. Shoals of bonbons and Christmas cakes of every imaginable kind, bearing all sorts of tender mottos, come out of their tin cases, setting off prospective indigestion against glad hearts. Christmas Day. Everybody has been busy today getting ready to celebrate the morrow and to keep the holidays. To this praiseworthy purpose I give, of course, every encouragement. The ship's stores contain nothing that is too good for the Christmas feast, which McCormick promises shall outdo that of his birthday. Unfortunately, he will be unable to give it his personal attention, for he is laid up with a frosted foot, which he got while hunting in some manner known only to himself. As no one at home likes to confess that he has been run away with and thrown from his steed, so no one here cares to own to the power of Jack Frost over him. To be frostbitten is the one standing reproach of this community. December 26th. Christmas has come and gone again, and has left upon the minds of all of us a pleasant recollection. To me it would have been a day of unalloyed pleasure, had it not been that my thoughts followed Sontag, and dwelt upon the sad loss that I have suffered in the death of my dogs. For the people were gay and lively, and to see them thus is now my first concern. Aside from all sentiment connected with wishing people happy, to me it has another meaning, for it is the guarantee of health. The ship's bell was hoisted to the masthead, and while the bells of other lands were pealing through the sunlight and over a world of gladness, ours sent its clear notes ringing through the darkness and the solitude. After this we met together in the cabin, and gave our thanks in our own modest way for the blessings which kind Heaven had vouchsafed us, and then each one set himself about his allotted duties. It is needless to say that these duties concerned chiefly the preparation and advancement of everything which concerned a Christmas dinner. The officers dressed the cabin with flags, and the sailors decorated their walls and beams with stripes of red, white, and blue flannel, which was loaned to them from the ship's stores. The schooner was illuminated throughout, and every lamp was called into requisition. An extra allowance of oil was granted to the occasion, and the upper deck was refulgent with light. 2 immense chandeliers were constructed for the dinner tables, and some gold and silver paper, strings of bangles, and strips of braid, kindly presented to us by Mr. Horstmann for the winter theatricals, which have never come off, covered the wood of which they were composed, and gave them quite an air of splendor, while 2 dozen of spermaceti candles brilliantly illuminated the apartments in which they hung. A short time before the dinner hour I visited the men's quarters, at their request, and was as much gratified with the taste that they had exhibited as with the heartiness with which they entered into the spirit of the day. Every nook and corner of the hold was as clean and tidy as possible. Everybody was busy and delighted. The cook might, however, be regarded as an exception to the latter rule, for the success of everybody's projects depended upon his skill, and he was closely watched. I halted at his red-hot galley stove and wished him a Merry Christmas. "T'ank you, sir," said he, "but I gets no time to think about the Merry Christmas. The commander see these big reindeers." And he went on vigorously basting 2 fine haunches of venison, which had been carefully treasured for the occasion, and putting the last touches to a kettle of tempting soup. Intending encouragement, I reminded him that his labours might be over with the serving of the dinner, when, with that consistency for which human nature is remarkable, especially in a ship's cook, he replied, "Please, sir, so long as my Heavenly Father gives me health, I likes to work." Merry Christmas. As I passed out of the hold into the officer's cabin, the crew sent after me 3 cheers, and 3 more for the expedition, and I don't know how many followed afterward for a Merry Christmas to ourselves. The upper deck was light and cheerful with the multitude of lamps, and had been cleared up with unusual care. And from amidships everything had been removed. This, Noel told me, was his work, and I was informed that there was to be a ball. The disposition to consume oil was contagious. Even the heathenish little wife of my absent hunter had managed to procure an additional supply, and rejoiced in an extra blaze in honour of the day, the meaning of which was all Greek to her. Her hut was a cheerful nest of furs, and little Pinguisig, with a strip of tough seal blubber, substituted for one of Goodyear's patent arrangements for children's gums, was laughing and crowing as a Christian baby would be expected to do on this most Christian day. Jacob, fat Jacob, was grinning in one corner. Charlie told me that he began grinning early in the morning, at the prospect of the many crumbs to come from so bounteous a feast, and in order to prepare himself for the task, he had swallowed a fox which Jensen brought in from one of his traps, and which he had turned over to the boy to skin. Out on the ice I found a boisterous group engaged around 2 large tin kettles. They were stirring something with wooden sticks, and I found that, at 34 degrees below zero, they were making water ice and Roman punch by wholesale. They needed no chemical compounds for their freezer. At 6 o'clock I joined the officers at dinner. Our glass and crockery has, in some mysterious manner known only to the steward, been disappearing from the time of leaving Boston, but there is plenty of tinware to supply the deficiency, and each cup contained a bouquet of flowers, cut from tissue paper, and a mammoth centerpiece of the same materials stood under the glittering chandelier. The dinner was much enjoyed by everybody, and if we lacked the orthodox turkey, the haunch was not a bad substitute. An Arctic ball, a pas de deux. I remained until 9 o'clock, and left the party to a merry evening. The hour for extinguishing the lights was put off at discretion, and having myself granted this privilege, I cannot, of course, say that any of the proprieties of discipline, or of shipboard life, were interfered with. Rejoiced to see that the people had the spirit to be merry at all, I was only too glad to encourage them in it. Every part of the festival, as they facetiously call it, was conducted in a very orderly manner. The ball came off as promised, and when I went up about midnight to have a look at the merrymakers, I found Nor, wrapped in furs, seated upon a keg, fiddling away in a very energetic manner, while Barnum and MacDonald were going through a sailor's hornpipe with immense éclat. Then Carl swung the steward round in the giddy mazes of the waltz, and finally Charlie set the ship shaking with laughter by attempting a pas de deux with Madame Hans. The old cook had crawled up the ladder from below, and, forgetting his troubles and his reindeers, applauded the actors vociferously. But he was soon observed to be making off from the gay and festive scene. A dozen voices called loudly after him, "Hello, cook! Come back and have a dance!" "What will me dance and make nonsense when there be no vimmens?" "But here's Mrs. Hans, cook." "Ugh!" And he dove below. January 1st, 1861. The Christmas holidays have passed quickly away, and the year of grace 1861 was born amid great rejoicings. We have just rung out the old and in the new. As the clock showed the midnight hour, the bell was tolled, our swivel gun sent a blaze of fire from its little throat into the darkness, and some fireworks went fizzing and banging into the clear sky. The rockets and blue lights gleamed over the snow with a weird and strange light, and the loud boom of the gun, and the crash of the bell echoing and re-echoing through the neighboring gorges, seemed like the voices of startled spirits of the solitude. End of Part 3. Part 4 of A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4, Deeds of Daring Do, 1920, by Wilfred T. Grenfell. The schooner Silver Queen, skipper Ambrose Loveday, was in serious trouble. Leading the van, as usual, of a great Labrador fleet of nearly 100 vessels bound north for the summer fishery, she had been the first in thick fog to run up against the heavy Arctic ice-field, which a sudden change to a strong northeasterly wind was driving rapidly in upon the coast. Real heavy ice it was, too. The huge pans, some nearly half a mile long, had sides like precipices, and were of that steely blue ice that cuts the soft planking of our northern vessels like a knife. The man at the masthead who was conning the schooner reported "ice everywhere, ne'er a drop of water to be seen." The floe was running in before the wind at a good knot an hour, which, when once its inner edge brings up against the cliffs that flank our eastern shore, meant pressure that would crush a vessel's ribs as a hydraulic press would those of a mosquito. Nor was there the faintest chance to put about and run back, for the big fleet lay too far inside the bay, and the skipper could make out that the feet of the mighty cliffs of Cape St. Peter, away on the horizon, were battling already with the southern edge of the great ice-field. Their only safety lay in getting anchorage, before it was too late, under the lee of a group of islands. The Silver Queen came about incontinently, and the fleet, warned by her movements, tacked also, heading right in for the land. Having a better offing from the ice than the Silver Queen, all the others safely reached the open water in the wake of the islands. The poor Silver Queen was caught in the treacherous embrace of two large pans of ice. A big spur pierced her side below the waterline, and then, as quickly slacking off again, left her in a sinking condition. Working at the pumps as only men in such dire need can work, the crew succeeded in keeping her afloat until she rounded the point of the land, where, with her decks already awash, they ran her on the rocks to prevent her sinking. A host of comrades in a swarm of motorboats were soon around the crippled ship, like bees around honey. Quickly and efficiently a big sail was sunk alongside and hauled under her keel and wrapped around her to cover the whole. Extra pumps brought aboard worked so fast that the water, attempting to rush in, drove the sail into the breach and gain was slowly made. After some patching and lightening of the hull, the schooner was freed enough of water to be towed up into a shallow arm of the roadstead, where, on the top of the high water, she was safely beached. Alas, the salt, $800 worth, and absolutely essential for the voyage, had melted out, and much of her provisions were ruined. Only a spontaneous collection of salt, taken up by all the other vessels, enabled the skipper to proceed with the voyage at all, and even then prospects for a Christmas dinner when he returned from the long cruise were anything but rosy. "Jeannie," he wrote to his wife, "it's you that will have to come to St. John's to do to spending fall, even if us do use our own salt. Else there'll be nothing but Drew diet for us to winter, I'm vowing." Skipper Ambrose thought a great deal of his home up south, where 3 children now detained the young wife, who at first had always shared his voyages, cheering and inspiring him in his troubles. As good luck would have it, after an anxious 3 weeks in which the plucky little schooner cruised many hundreds of miles in the vain search for a voyage, she ran right into the great body of codfish that every year come browsing along out of the Gulf into the Atlantic, through the Straits of Belle Isle, as soon as those waters get too warm to suit the bait fish on which they feed. Skipper Ambrose managed to send news of his better fortune home by a vessel that got her load early, and which he had been lucky enough to intercept on her voyage south. "There'll be enough yet, Jeannie, please God, if you does the laying out of it, and maybe old Santa won't have to pass St. Rose after all," was his message. The masts of the Silver Queen had hardly topped the horizon of St. Rose Harbor on her return early in October before the whole Loveday household were somehow aware of the fact, and so quickly did Jeannie have the 3 all spruced up that she was alongside with them in the boat before the anchor chain had stopped running through the schooner's hawse-pipe. "Yes, us have used our salt, lass," said the skipper proudly, "and us would have used twice as much if us had had it. But the old ship got a nasty squeeze in Tryste, and, in spite of the patch us put on her, she wasted a power of it again, whiles us was beating about after the fish. Guess you'll have to come along, Jeannie, if 'tis money to reach to Christmas things. Can't leave the kiddies? Oh, the neighbor will keep an eye on they. Us won't be long, anyhow. Johnny needs tending? Well, yous can bring Johnny along if yous feared to leave him home." Jeannie's protests were all in vain, and in spite of her better judgment, she yielded at last to her husband's importunity. Thus it happened that when the fish had been dried and marketed in St. John's, and all the money spent, the Silver Queen left one fine morning, again northward bound, with more than the usual modest quantity of bunting at her masthead, to signify that the skipper's wife and lad were aboard with him, and that with a well-stocked vessel and happy hearts they were off to spend a Merry Christmas in their little home on the northern coast. Everything was stowed away snugly, every hatch was closely battened down, and by dark the Silver Queen was speeding along north in smooth water under the land, before a spanking westerly wind. With the advent of night the wind freshened, veering slightly against them, so that sail was shortened, sheets hauled down, and the passengers early tucked away securely in their bunks. Towards midnight the breeze freshened to a northwesterly gale, and double-reefed both fore and aft, the little schooner was clinging on to the land to hold the shelter of the cliffs as long as possible. The powerful light of the Bonavista Cape was now abeam, and flashing down from its lofty perch on the hilltops warned the skipper that soon he would pass the protecting shelter of the land, and be facing the full force of the gale in the open. St. Rhodes Harbor lay right ahead. It was only 30 miles across to the land that spelled home and safety. The ship was stout. Close hauled, she could lay across on the wind. The skipper had made this journey so often before that to hesitate at crossing never entered his mind. Some men would have put about and hugged the land, at least until daylight, but not so Skipper Ambrose. A few minutes later, he and his little ship were facing the full fury of the gale as serenely as most of us would face our breakfast at home. Real typhoons, tornadoes, and cyclones are not known in the North. Whether now a rare specimen had escaped from its path, or whether this was merely the accumulation of force from the pent-up fury of the wind buffeting around the mighty cliffs of the headland, it is impossible to say. But suddenly the good ship began to turn over. At first she just lay down, as every good boat will do in heavy wind. But alas, this time she was failing to recover herself. It seemed for all the world as if some great, invisible hand were pressing her slowly down. She shivered and struggled like some small, wild animal under the paw of a mighty lion, all to no purpose. Steadily, inch by inch, down she went. She had already gone altogether too far for recovery, when a sea, sweeping over her, broke right into her mainsail, snapped off her mainmast at the gammon, and slowly the half-drowned little craft righted herself once more. One moment's hesitation, while, half full of water, she lay rolling in the trough of the sea, her broadside exposed to the great combers that came sweeping by, must have sealed her fate forever then and there. But the helm was up, the foresheet was out to the knot, and the battened hull running straight before the seas out into the open Atlantic, while a landsman would have been recovering his feet, or before he could have guessed what had happened. Down below decks everything seemed quiet and secure again now, and the skipper's shout down the companion to his wife to keep right on sleeping was, he thought, all that was needed to restore her confidence. Though the winter boxes and barrels had been so well stowed, and were so tightly jammed from the ballast deck to the beams, that very little of the ballast itself had stirred when the vessel hove down, things were far from cheerful, the pumps scarcely gaining on the water in the well. The wreckage was successfully cut away without piercing her hull, and the following seas so far made no breach over her. But she was only a small schooner. She had been badly crushed in the ice in the spring, she had only one mast left, and it was already winter north of the roaring Forties. The only possible way to keep her afloat was to run her right on before the wind into the open ocean, and even then there was no hope unless they were seen and taken off by some passing steamer. Daylight brought little comfort to the stricken ship. Gallantly she ran on before mountains of water which towered away above her stern, and which every now and again broke fiercely just under her counter. The skipper had lashed himself firmly to the helm, where he was soaked to the skin by the tail ends of many of the seas that lurched over the taffrail in the darkness. Not for 1 second had he allowed even the mate to relieve him, knowing that at any moment the lives of all on board might hang on a single turn of the wheel. The second mate and deckhand, almost played out, were still working at the pumps, when at last, after daylight, the captain went forward for a moment. "Go below, lads," he said, "and get some dry clothes. She's riding all right, but I want you both forward again as soon as you're ready. Her decks are badly strained, and she's making a lot of water forward." "All right, skipper," and the two weary men, glad of an excuse to forget their troubles for a moment, fell over one another in their haste to get first to the forecastle. The tough old mainmast, before breaking off, had so strained the deck that great gaps were left, through which the water was pouring, and accounted for the constantly rising water in the well. Temporary relief was secured by clamping heavy canvas over the seams, and everyone's heart rose when once more the eternal swash in the bilges was silenced for the time being, for it is a dirge which is enough to discourage the stoutest of hearts in time. Though there was no abating of the storm as the day wore on, there was no time for anxiety. Not only had the pumps to be worked incessantly, and the decks to be caulked, but the foremast, on which even their temporary safety depended, had been so badly strained when the mainmast went by the board that its rigging had to be reinforced and its preventer stays rigged to hold even the bare pole standing. Tangled rags of the sails, flapping dismally against the shrouds, were the sole remnants of the ship's canvas. Every ounce of help being necessary to save the ship, no one even thought of food. Meanwhile, rough as it was, they were able to keep her running directly before the seas, and so smother the movement of the vessel sufficiently to make the skipper, who found only a rare moment to shout a word of cheer down the hatchway, fully believe that he was keeping his wife in ignorance of the real state of things on deck. With that end in view, he had even spared the cook for a few minutes to carry her food as usual. That through the second awful night his wife should still be staying quietly below was an infinite comfort to the brave heart on deck. Little was he aware what every woman knows. Yet the realization that his vessel was sailing to certain destruction in mid-Atlantic, and that he was himself responsible for carrying her to seemingly sure death, was almost more than he could bear. The loss of the salt, the outfit, anything and everything that had gone in the spring misadventure, and which had meant terrible losses to him, he had taken like every true seaman takes adversity, only as a stimulus to more effective action. But, as with most sailors, under a moment that his whole mind was not absorbed in the fight with the seas, the thought that it was partly his own selfishness that was responsible for his wife and child being aboard the doomed schooner tortured him like a fresh knife stab. So the second night wore interminably away. Years of experience had made it second nature to Skipper Ambrose to handle the Silver Queen. Since the time when, with his father and brothers, he had built and launched her at the head of Birch Inlet, he had sailed her himself every season. It was she that had enabled him to obtain a home, to find his partner in life, and to support his children as they came along. She would obey no one as she would him, and in these terrible hours he would let no one try. The suddenly smooth sea was, he knew, only waiting relief from the wind pressure to surge once more into mountains that would dangerously menace the ship. So again, at night, he lashed himself to the helm, a very vigil of prayer that it is the lot of few men to know. The craft was now far out in the Atlantic, and the terror of the steep seas on the shallow waters of the Great Banks, to a vessel in her condition, was every moment looming up like some dread spectre that would suddenly overpower them all. Yet he dared not alter the ship's course one iota to avoid them. Hour after hour the insensate hurricane swept everything before it. By morning there was no longer any possible hope of clearing the banks, so they must incur the terrible extra risk of opening the hatches in order to jettison cargo, and so lighten the ship. The first streak of dawn was just lighting up the face of the watery waste, and the skipper, after repeated warnings and instructions, had just handed the helm to his second hand, and was forward with the mate, helping to open and close the main hatch as each barrel and box was hauled on deck and flung over the side. For the 100th time he had turned round to keep his eye on the helmsman, when suddenly he became aware of a woman's figure emerging from the after companion and approaching the man at the wheel. She was carrying something in her hand. It was a cup with a steaming liquid in it. Surely that woman could not be Jeanie. She must be sleeping at that hour. His mind must be going. He dropped the hatch and stood staring before him into the semi-darkness as if turned into a pillar of stone. A moment passed, and he had not moved a finger. "What's the matter, skipper?" broke in the frightened mate. "Whatever are you seeing?" All the skipper's reply was a mechanical walk aft, as a man might do in a dream. "Jeanie," he found words at last, when he had actually touched her arm. "Jeanie, is it you? What are you doing on deck this weather? No place for you, darlin'. Bad enough for us men." And he put out his hand as if to lead her below again. Yet he felt somehow as though there were no need for it now. She seemed in some way different to the gentle little woman of his home. He could not tell quite what it was that was strange, but there was a light in her eyes and even a joy that he felt he had never noticed there before. Instead of trying to direct her, therefore, he was satisfied just to touch her arm again, as if to be quite sure it was herself. Then his eye fell on the steaming mug of coffee, and he remembered that they had eaten nothing for 2 days, had not even thought of it, and instantly there came to his mind the picture of a man standing on a wreck he had read of, and reminding the crew, "It is now 14 days, and you've eaten nothing." Jeanie had not spoken yet, but somehow he felt that he knew exactly what she would say, and that he ought to wait for her to speak. He could almost hear that man on the wreck, now nearly 2,000 years ago, going on with almost the words in which she was now beginning to say, "Last night, as I lay in my bunk, though I thought I was awake, I seemed to be going into the door of our own house at St. Rhodes. There was no one round, so I went upstairs. It was early morning, but the children were awake and cried out with joy at seeing me. Then they dressed and came downstairs, and there was a big rattling at the door, and you came stumbling in, carrying a huge pack on your back. At first I couldn't make out what you were doing, but when you put down the pack and looked up, the children began to shout. For your face had become round and red, and your whiskers long and white, and you were growing fatter and fatter. Suddenly I knew that we were at home on Christmas Day, and somehow we had a power of things for Christmas. Then, just as I said, 'Thank God,' it all vanished away. But it was so real, I'm certain it'll be exactly as I've said. We must all take courage. None of us'll be drowned." A minute or two passed, the skipper standing with bowed head and making a fine picture in his shining oilskins. It seemed like the close of a simple religious service. As his wife stopped speaking, the two went silently below. "I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health," he could hear the brave old man of his memory saying. Jeanie made no further comment, and without at all realizing what he was doing, he found himself stirring the fire in the cabin stove. The uneasy motion of the vessel warned him that the water was shoaling, and the banks getting nearer. But he had forgotten to worry, and soon had the kettle refilled and boiling, and a fresh pot of steaming coffee brewed. Calling all hands except the helmsman, the skipper said grace in his simple way, and, as in the vision of his memory, then they were all of a good cheer, and they also took some meat. How deliverance was to come, no one could possibly guess. Already the scudding ship had passed far to the south of the track of steamers. All day and yet another night went by, the worst night of all in many ways, for the steep seas of the banks curled over more than once onto the schooner's taffrail, and the strained hull, working more and more under the stress and drag of the seas, had allowed the ever-increasing quantity of water in the hold to gain dangerously on the pumps. It had become obvious to all that if help was to come, it must be soon. When the evening of that third night settled down, it was only Jeanie's optimism that saved the ship. Beset with their never-ending tasks, the worn-out crew had not even noticed that the skipper's wife had assumed the role of cook, nor had the exuberance of good things that were constantly being passed up to them struck them as strange. Never in all her life had the Silver Queen seen such days. Sugar and milk accompanied the mugs of tea that were on draft at all hours of the day and night. Alcohol there was none, but the frills of Christmas were flowing all day on the deck of that sinking vessel. For the new cook had access to the stock that St. Nicholas had destined for St. Rhodes Harbor, and she was cheating Father Neptune of them in the only way possible. Just before daylight on the fourth morning, the watch, dashing aft, yelled to the skipper, "Steamer's light on the port bow, not more than a mile away." There wasn't a moment to lose, or they would be just as ships passing in the night, for all hands realized that the chances of the steamer's watch seeing the waterlogged fishing boat with only one bare stick standing in the half-darkness were very small indeed. But a Newfoundland fisherman, like the native weasel, is not to be caught napping. In less time than it takes to tell, flares were alight from end to end of the doomed vessel, and the old sealing gun of Skipper Ambrose was barking out its hoarse appeal as fast as it could be reloaded. Realizing that it was the last cast of the die, with the skill of his craft, he also began edging the old hull to windward, which had the double advantage of slowing down her pace and bringing her more across the steamer's path. An answering flare from the stranger's deck soon set their minds at rest that they had been seen. The problem of doing anything to help them, however, seemed utterly insoluble. Only the God-given genius of the sea and the indomitable pluck of British sailors in the face of danger could even now possibly save them. Dawn found the small and buffeted ocean tramp bravely standing by, and the impossible was actually being attempted. 6 men in a small boat were preparing to be lowered over the great rolling iron wall into the cauldron of that storm-driven sea. No one who has not seen it tried can begin to appreciate the difficulty. To get the boat safely into the water and away from the ship's side is almost an impossibility. It is the one great problem in shipwreck. Untold lives have been lost through failure in the attempt to launch the boats. Who would have blamed these men, who themselves had loved ones dependent on them at home, had they decided that the risk was unjustifiable? There was neither glory nor money if they succeeded, and a terrible death for nothing if they failed. Why do men of the sea do these deeds? Shall such be judged hereafter by their creeds? This time the launching was successful, in spite of an awful crash as the boat, hanging at full length of the falls, was driven before an irresistible mountain of water into the ship's side. But the straining eyes from the wreck saw her sheer off and start drifting down towards them. On she came, now visible high in the air, topping the crest of a huge comber, and then again there was a horrible dread that she would never reappear, as the moments went by and she was lost from sight amidst the steep, watery valleys. Suddenly there she was again, towering now right above the waterlogged wreck that lay deep in a great chasm below her. Surely she must crack like a nutshell if they touched. Yet, if she was swept by, with her would go the last chance for life. Again these common seamen snatched victory from the impossible. 2 of the steamer's crew had actually leaped aboard, and, making fast, were literally carrying in their arms across that raging gulf a woman and a helpless child. The schooner, left without a helmsman, had immediately broached to, and the seas were already making clean sweeps over her. The skipper, who held on till the last, was, however, not kept long waiting. The men, leaping into space one after the other, and being dragged aboard by the rough, deft hands of the boat's crew, even when safely in the boat, knew that the difficulty of scaling the lofty side of the steamer as she lay rolling to and fro in the troughs and crests of the great sea was almost insurmountable. The child was lashed up in one of the men's coats, and somehow hauled on deck by a rope. The woman, like the men, actually climbed over the rocking side of the towering craft by a long, dangling rope ladder. A few days later they were all landed in Sydney Harbour, But long before they arrived there, their story had become common property aboard their rescuer, and the sympathies of these men of rough exterior had been deeply touched. Skipper Ambrose, with his wife, child, and crew, were soon shipped home as wrecked sailors. All their hard-won outfit had been lost. Even their scanty stock of personal clothing had gone. Needless to say, there was nothing left for Christmas Day, and the little stockings that were hung up as usual in St. Rhodes were all empty that morning. But it so happened that about 2 o'clock Christmas afternoon, the last mail boat for the season butted into the standing ice at the harbor mouth. To his intense surprise, Skipper Ambrose, who had gone off to land the mails with his team of dogs, found a large crate, plainly labeled with his own name. He hauled the mysterious package home, and it was promptly pried open in the presence of all the family. There were packages for all the family. Not one had been forgotten. A wonderful jacket and warm gloves were labeled Mrs. Jean Loveday. A spanking new woolen sweater bore the brief legend Skipper Ambrose, while on no less than 4 parcels they discovered the name of Johnny Loveday. Somehow, even little Phyllis and Mary found boxes containing wonderful dolls and a real teddy bear with their names penciled on them. There were boxes of candies, bags of fruit, a tin of cocoa, some sugar, and heaven knows what, and the strange thing was that every package bore somebody's name. It was perfectly marvelous, for in that Christmas box was just exactly what every single one in the family wanted most on earth. The minister himself could not have persuaded the little Lovedays that it wasn't St. Nicholas who had come in by sea instead of on his reindeer, and I'm not sure they weren't right. All the same, Jeanie has her suspicions that some rough sailor-men from the crew of a certain ocean tramp could have thrown some light on the subject had they wished. End of Part 4. Part 5 of A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 5, Christmas, from the Observations of Professor Maturin, 1916, by Claude First. Christmas. It is always possible to divine something of the state of Professor Maturin's mind from the order or the congestion of his books and papers. When, therefore, the other day I found him behind a perfect rampart of volumes bristling with paper markers, I knew that he was loading with some new knowledge or other, and meditated how I might draw his fire. But he anticipated my efforts by sallying from his fortification, dishevelled but beaming, with the salvo, "God rest ye merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay." "What will you give for the Christmas spirit?" he continued. "I have been seeking it seasonably, and believe that I have found it." I capitulated immediately, and we sat down by the fire for a parley, which he began promptly. The Christmas spirit appears to be inherent in human nature, in the climatic change from summer seed-time through autumn harvest to hearty winter relaxation and cheer over the garnered fruits of husbandry or art. In the South it began as the winter feast of Saturn, celebrated with masking and gifts. In the North it was Odin's, with log fires and feasting. Then the early Christian fathers chose it for celebrating their founder's new teaching of peace and goodwill. Gradually all of this blended into the most interesting mingling of the material and the spiritual that we have in all our manners and customs. The traditions of the shepherds and the star, the nativity, and the wise men of the East became the center of the celebration. But the medieval popularity of Macrobius' book on the Saturnalia perpetuated its carnival and games, its candles and garlands, and its giving of gifts, especially to children. The descending Teutons brought their wassail and their tree ceremonials. Germany added St. Nicholas, Santa Claus, and the filling of stockings. France seemed to have furnished the carols. England elaborated the season's food and drink, and America contributed the turkey. With the growth of church and state, the day became one of pomp and circumstance. Westminster Abbey was consecrated on Christmas in 1065, and William was crowned there the next Christmas. Other episcopal and royal functions followed, until more was spent on this season than in all the year beside. There were special buildings, elaborate pageants, elaborately set, and feasts of 500 dishes, with 60 oxen for one course, and 800-pound plum puddings. There were jousts at which 300 spears were broken, and the presentation of as many as 30 plays. Earlier, the plays were religious. Later, Shakespeare provided the court play for Christmas 1601, and Ben Jonson for 1616. Milton's Comus was presented at Ludlow Castle during the Christmas season of 1634. The universities and the Inns of Court were likewise keen for plays, and for the Boar's Head served with minstrelsy. The aristocracy and gentry kept open house for sometimes as many as 300 persons. Sir Roger de Coverley sent a string of puddings and a pack of cards to every poor family in the parish, and rich decedents left Christmas dinners and gifts to the poor. The peasantry entered heartily into seasonable mummery and games, dances and songs, so industriously thumbing the many early printed books of carols that almost none of them remain. Everywhere indoor leisure and the seasonable mood gave rise to all sorts and conditions of legendary lore, of spirits, of trees that flower, and animals that speak on Christmas Eve, and of weather wisdom like, "If Christmas Day on Friday be, the frost of winter hard shall be." From the beginning, the spirit of the celebration had to wage war with the flesh. The Fathers of the Church never ceased to remonstrate that festivity endangered the solemnity of the season. There were constant failures to remember the peaceful character of the feast. The Danes fell on King Alfred while he was celebrating Christmas in 878, and William the Conqueror got into York on Christmas in 1069 by sending in spies with good-will gifts of food. The medieval Lords of Misrule, originally established to control festivity, became themselves uncontrolled and had to be abolished. "Even though they made some very good laws," I interrupted, "against eating 2 dinners in one day and kissing without leave." The Pilgrim Fathers at Plymouth frowned on current excesses by working on Christmas Day in 1620, and by later prohibiting its celebration. Cromwell's Parliament sat every Christmas Day from 1644 to 1656, and sermonized and legislated against the celebration as a carnal feast, ordering churches shut, shops open, and decorations down. But this was too extreme, and the people smashed the shop windows and put up more evergreens than the Lord Mayor's men could burn, and Evelyn delighted in being arrested for going to church on Christmas in 1657. In 5 years all was so changed that Pepys could for once combine preaching and practice by hearing a Christmas sermon on joyousness and having plum pudding and mince pie for dinner. From the beginning, too, the spirit of benevolence has had its difficulties. Watchmen left verses at doors, wanderers sang carols, and children chanted, "I've got a little pocket to put a penny in," until such suggestion to benevolence became a little too definite, and it was legislated against. In 1668, Pepys says tipping "cost me much money this Christmas already, and will do more." Half a century later, Swift writes, "By the Lord Harry, I shall be done with Christmas boxes. The rogues at the coffee house have raised their tax, every one giving a crown, and I gave mine for shame, besides a great many half-crowns to great men's porters, etc." Of other giving, Swift writes, "Making agreeable presents is an affair as delicate as most in the course of life," and he never fails to caution Stella against a new danger, that of losing her money in Christmas gaming. Concerning this custom, Walpole wrote on Twelfth Day in 1752, His Majesty, according to annual custom, offered myrrh, frankincense, and a small bit of gold, and at night, in commemoration of the 3 kings or wise men, the king and royal family played at hazard. His most sacred Majesty won 3 guineas, and His Royal Highness the Duke 3,400 pounds. Concerning gifts, Walpole instances the charming presents devised for a little girl of 10 by the Duchess of Suffolk and Lord Chetwynd, aged 76 and 80 respectively, and he prescribes the theory, "Pray, remember not to ruin yourself in presents. A very slight gift of a guinea or 2 obliges as much, is more fashionable, and not a moment sooner forgotten than a magnificent one, and then you may cheaply oblige the more persons." Such being the earlier history and tradition of the festival, what should be its modern spirit? I inquired. For that, too, continued Professor Maturin, there is no lack of leading. Charles Lamb is frankly for the good old munching system, ingens gloria apopasti aurum, and does not hesitate to prescribe for Christmas 1800 snipes exactly at 9, punch at 10, with argument, difference of opinion expected about 11, perfect unanimity with some haziness and dimness before 12. Thomas Love Peacock makes his Reverend Dr. Opimian say, about 1860, "I think much of Christmas and all its associations. I like the idea of the Yule log. I like the festoons of holly on the walls and windows, the dance under the mistletoe, the gigantic sausage, the baron of beef, the vast globe of plum pudding, the tapping of the old October, the inexhaustible bowl of punch. I like the idea of what is gone, and I can still enjoy the reality of what remains." Dr. Opimian further prescribes for the season such merry tales as his contemporary Inglesby legends provide in the distinguished career but inglorious end of The Spectre of Tappington, which nightly made away with the trousers of the guest who occupied the haunted room at Christmas. All of these same hearty traditions are perpetuated by Fenimore Cooper in his description of Christmas festivity in The Pioneers. "Does not Washington Irving," I asked, "have an important place in the tradition?" "Precisely so," continued Professor Maturin. "It was reserved for him, from his knowledge of Dutch and English customs, to make a new selection and recombination of Christmas ideals so appealing as to have set the standard ever since. His half-dozen Christmas papers dwell, with his characteristic love of the past, on the superior honesty, kindliness, and joy of the old holiday customs. No refinement of elegance can replace, he maintains, the family gatherings, the perfecting of sympathies, the realization of mutual dependence, and the increase of mutual affection, instinct in the ancient hospitality." To his own question as to the worth of Christmas observances, he gives the most characteristic answer in his philosophy: "There is plenty of wisdom in the world, but we need more sound pleasure to beguile care and increase benevolence and good humor." It was this ethical intention to re-establish the old tradition of kindliness that Dickens followed, with the result of again endearing the season, as Mr. Howells had said, to the whole English-speaking world with a wider and deeper hold than it had ever had before, the chief agency in universalizing the great Christmas holiday as we now have it. There is no need to remind anyone how the whole baker's dozen of Dickens' Christmas stories delightfully champion hard work and good cheer, sympathy and benevolence, affection and self-sacrifice, and even the softening effects of suffering and sorrow. Sometimes by directly illustrating these blessings, again by picturing the misery of their opposites. His satires at pretended benevolence and commercial greed, and his championship of the common man, answer in advance all later criticisms concerning the burden and the cost of Christmas and current complaints over popular ingratitude. "I have great faith in the poor," Dickens once wrote. "To the best of my ability, I always endeavor to present them in a favorable light to the rich, and I shall never cease, I hope, until I die, to advocate their being made as happy and as wise as the circumstances of their condition in its utmost improvement will admit." Thackeray called Dickens' Christmas stories a national benefit, and to any man or woman who reads them a personal kindness. And Thackeray, too, served the season with Christmas pieces of sympathy, humor, and pantomime, and with his famous onslaught on pretentious misanthropy. You recall how the Times slated one of his Christmas stories as worthless on the very day that the publishers asked for a second edition, and how Thackeray, in the preface to the second edition, an essay on thunder and small beer, made such delightful fun of the review's futility, its absurd superciliousness, its inflated language, and its false figures of speech, that snarling criticism learned at least a temporary lesson. Thackeray waged his war differently from Dickens, but on the whole I have found nothing more compactly adequate on the Christmas spirit than Thackeray's "I wish you health and love and mirth, as fits the solemn Christmastide," unless it be the conclusion to old Nicholas Breton's Fantastics, written in 1626. In brief, I thus conclude it: I hold it a memory of heaven's love and the world's peace, the mirth of the honest and the meeting of the friendly. Farewell. End of Part 5. Part 6 of A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 6, Vera's First Christmas Adventure, from The Grim Smile of the Five Towns, 1907, by Arnold Bennett. 1. 5 days before Christmas, Cheserdine came home to his wife from a week's sojourn in London on business. Vera, in her quality of the best-dressed woman in Bursley, met him on the doorstep, or thereabouts, of their charming but childless home, attired in a tea-gown that would have ravished a far less impressionable male than her husband, while he, in his quality of a prosaic and flourishing earthenware manufacturer, pretended to take the tea-gown as a matter of course, and gave her the sober, solid kiss of a man who has been married 6 years and is getting used to it. Still, the tea-gown had pleased him, and by certain secret symptoms Vera knew that it had pleased him. She hoped much from that tea-gown. She hoped that he had come home in a more pacific temper than he had shown when he left her, and that she would carry her point after all. Now, naturally, when a husband in easy circumstances, the possessor of a pretty and pampered wife, spends a week in London and returns 5 days before Christmas, certain things are rightly and properly to be expected from him. It would need an astounding courage, an amazing lack of a sense of the amenity of conjugal existence in such a husband, to enable him to disappoint such reasonable expectations. And Cheserdine, though capable of pulling the curb very tight on the caprices of his wife, was a highly decent fellow. He had no intention to disappoint. He knew his duty. So that, during afternoon tea with the tea-gown in a cosy corner of the great Chippendale drawing-room, he began to unfasten a small wooden case which he had brought into the house in his own hand, opened it with considerable precaution, making a fine mess of packing-stuff on the carpet, and gradually drew to light a pair of vases of Venetian glass. He put them on the mantelpiece. "There," he said proudly, and with a virtuous air. They were obviously costly antique vases, exquisite in form, exquisite in the graduated tints of their pale blue and rose. 17th century, he said. "They're very nice," Vera agreed, with a show of enthusiasm. "What are they for?" "Your Christmas present," Cheserdine explained, and added, "my dear." "Oh, Stephen," she murmured. A kiss on these occasions is only just, and Cheserdine had one. "Duvines told me they were quite unique," he said modestly, "and I believe 'em." You might imagine that a pair of Venetian vases of the 17th century, stated by Duvines to be unique, would have satisfied a woman who had a generous dress allowance and lacked absolutely nothing that was essential. But Vera was not satisfied. She was, on the contrary, profoundly disappointed, for the presence of those vases proved that she had not carried her point. They deprived her of hope. The unpleasantness before Cheserdine went to London had been more or less apropos of a Christmas present. Vera had seen in Bostick's vast emporium in the neighbouring town of Hambridge a music-stool in the style known as Art Nouveau, which had enslaved her fancy. She had taken her husband to see it, and it had not enslaved her husband's fancy in the slightest degree. It was made in light woods, and the woods were curved and twisted as though they had recently spent 7 years in a purgatory for sinful trees. Here and there in the design onyx stones had been set in the wood. The seat itself was beautifully soft. What captured Vera was chiefly the fact that it did not open at the top, as most elaborate music stools do, but at either side. You pressed a button, onyx, and the panel fell down, displaying your music in little compartments, ready to hand. And the eastern moiety of the music-stool was for piano pieces, and the western moiety for songs. In short, it was the last word of music-stools. Nothing could possibly be newer. But Cheserdine did not like it, and did not conceal his opinion. He argued that it would not go with the Chippendale furniture, and Vera said that all beautiful things went together, and Cheserdine admitted that they did, rather dryly. You see, they took the matter seriously, because the house was their hobby. They were always changing its interior, which was more than they could have done for a child, even if they had had one. And Cheserdine's finer and soberer taste was always fighting against Vera's predilection for the novel and the bizarre. Apart from clothes, Vera had not much more than the taste of a mouse. They did not quarrel in Bostick's. Indeed, they did not quarrel anywhere. But after Vera had suggested that he might at any rate humour her by giving her the music-stool for a Christmas present, she seemed to think this would somehow help it to go with the Chippendale, and Cheserdine had politely but firmly declined, there had been a certain coolness and quite 6 tears. Vera had caused it to be understood that even if Cheserdine was not interested in music, even if he did hate music, and did call the Broadwood Ebony Grand ugly, that was no reason why she should be deprived of a pretty and original music-stool that would keep her music tidy, and that would be hers. As for it not going with the Chippendale, that was simply an excuse, etc. Hence it was not surprising that the Venetian vases of the 17th century left Vera cold, and that the domestic prospects for Christmas were a little cold. However, Vera, with wifely and submissive tact, made the best of things, and that evening she began to decorate the hall, dining-room, and drawing-room with holly and mistletoe. Before the pair retired to rest, the true Christmas feeling, slightly tinged with a tender melancholy, permeated the house, and the servants were growing excited in advance. The servants weren't going to have a dinner party with crackers and port and a table centre unmatched in the Five Towns. The servants weren't going to invite their friends to an evening's jollity. The servants were merely going to work somewhat harder and have somewhat less sleep. But such is the magical effect of holly and mistletoe, twined round picture cords and hung under chandeliers, that the excitement of the servants was entirely pleasurable. And as Vera shut the bedroom door, she said with a delightful, forgiving smile, "I saw a lovely cigar cabinet at Bostick yesterday." "Oh," said Cheserdine, touched. He had no cigar cabinet, and he wanted one. And Vera knew that he wanted one. And Vera slept in the sweet consciousness of her thoughtful wifeliness. The next morning, at breakfast, Cheserdine demanded, "Getting pretty hard up, aren't you, Maria?" He called her Maria when he wished to be arch. "Well," she said, "as a matter of fact, I am. What with the—" And he gave her a £5 note. It happened so every year. He provided her with the money to buy him a Christmas present. But it is, I hope, unnecessary to say that the connection between her present to him and the money he furnished was never crudely mentioned. She made an opportunity, before he left for the works, to praise the Venetian vases, and she insisted that he should wrap up well, because he was showing signs of one of his bad colds. 2. In the early afternoon she went to Bostick's Emporium at Hambridge to buy the cigar cabinet and a few domestic trifles. Bostick's is a good shop. I do not say that it has the classic and serene dignity of Brunt's over the way, where one orders one's dining-room suites and one's frocks for the January dances. But it is a good shop, and one of the chief glories of the Paris of the Five Towns. It has frontages in 3 streets, and it might be called the shop of the 100 windows. You can buy pretty nearly anything at Bostick's, from an Art Nouveau music stool up to the highest cheese, for there is a provision department. You can't get cheese at Brunt's. Vera made her uninteresting purchases first in the basement, and then she went upstairs to the special Christmas department, which certainly was wonderful. A blaze and splendor of electric light, a glitter of gilded, iridescent toys and knick-knacks, a smiling, excited, pushing multitude of faces, young and old, and the cashiers in their cages gathering in money as fast as they could lay their tired hands on it. A joyous, brilliant scene, calculated to bring soft tears of satisfaction to the board of directors that presided over Bostick's. It was a record Christmas for Bostick's. The electric cars were thundering over the frozen streets of all the 5 towns to bring customers to Bostick's. Children dreamt of Bostick's. Fathers went to scoff and remained to pay. Brunt's was not exactly alarmed, for nothing could alarm Brunt's, but there was just a sort of suspicion of something in the air at Brunt's that did not make for odious self-conceit. People seemed to become intoxicated when they went into Bostick's, to close their heads in a frenzy of buying. And there the Art Nouveau music stool stood in the corner, where Vera had originally seen it. She approached it, not thinking of the terrible danger. The compartments for music lay invitingly open. £4 9 6, Mrs. Cheserdine, said a shop-walker who knew her. She stopped to finger it. Well, of course, everybody is acquainted with that peculiar ecstasy that undoubtedly does overtake you in good shops sometimes, especially at Christmas. I prefer to call it ecstasy rather than intoxication, but I have heard it called even drunkenness. It is a magnificent and overwhelming experience, like a good wine. A blind instinct seizes your reason and throws her out of the window of your soul, and then assumes entire control of the volitional machinery. You listen to no arguments, you care for no consequences, you want a thing, you must have it, you do have it. Vera was caught unawares by this magnificent and overwhelming experience, just as she stooped to finger the music stool. A fig for the cigar cabinet, a fig for her husband's objections. After all, she was a grown-up woman, 29 or 30, and entitled to a certain freedom. She was not, and would not, be a slave. It would look perfect in the drawing-room. "I'll take it," she said. "Yes, Mrs. Cheserdine, a unique thing, quite unique." Pinkerton. And Vera followed Pinkerton to a cash desk and received half a guinea out of a £5 note. "I want it carefully packed," said Vera. "Yes, ma'am, it will be delivered in the morning." She was just beginning to realize that she had been under the sinister influence of the ecstasy, and that she had not bought the cigar cabinet, and that she had practically no more money, and that Stephen's rule against credit was the strictest of all his rules, when she caught sight of Mr. Charles Woodruff buying toys, doubtless for his nephews and nieces. Mr. Woodruff was the bachelor friend of the family. He had loved Vera before Stephen loved her, and he was still attached to her. Stephen and he were chums of the most advanced kind. Why, Stephen and Vera thought nothing of bickering in front of Mr. Woodruff, who rated them both and sided with neither. "Hello," said Woodruff, flushing, and moving his long, clumsy limbs when she touched him on the shoulder. "I'm just buying a few toys." She helped him to buy toys, and then he asked her to go and have tea with him at the newly opened Sub Rosa Tea Rooms in Macon Street. She agreed, and in passing the music-stool, she gave a small parcel which she was carrying to Pinkerton, and told him he might as well put it in the music-stool. She was glad to have tea with Charlie Woodruff. It would distract her, prevent her from thinking. The ecstasy had almost died out, and she had a violent desire not to think. 3. A terrible blow fell upon her the next morning. Stephen had one of his bad colds, one of his worst. The mere cold she could have supported with fortitude, but he was forced to remain indoors, and his presence in the house she could not support with fortitude. The music-stool would be sure to arrive before lunch, and he would be there to see it arrive. The ecstasy had fully expired now, and she had more leisure to think than she wanted. She could not imagine what mad instinct had compelled her to buy the music-stool. Once out of the shop, these instincts always are difficult to imagine. She knew that Stephen would be angry. He might perhaps go to the length of returning the music-stool whence it came. For though she was a pretty and pampered woman, Stephen had a way, in the last resort, of being master of his own house. And she could not even placate him with the gift of a cigar cabinet. She could not buy a 5-guinea cigar cabinet with 10 and 6. She had no other money in the world. She never had money, yet money was always running through her fingers. Stephen treated her generously, gave her an ample allowance, but he would under no circumstances permit credit, nor would he pay her allowance in advance. She had nothing to expect till the new year. She attended to his cold, and telephoned to the works for a clerk to come up, and she refrained from telling Stephen that he must have been very careless while in London to catch a cold like that. Her self-denial in this respect surprised Stephen, but he put it down to the beneficent influence of Christmas and the Venetian vases. Bostock's pair-horse van arrived before the garden gate earlier than her worst fears had anticipated, and Bostock's men were evidently in a tremendous hurry that morning. In quite an abnormally small number of seconds, the wooden case containing the fragile music-stool was lying in the inner hall, waiting to be unpacked. Having signed the delivery book, Vera stood staring at the accusatory package. Stephen was lounging over the dining-room fire, perhaps dozing. She would have the thing swiftly transported upstairs and hidden in an attic for a time. But just then Stephen popped out of the dining-room. Stephen's masculine curiosity had been aroused by the advent of Bostock's van. He had observed the incoming of the package from the window, and he had ventured to the hall to inspect it. The event had roused him wonderfully from the heavy torpor which a cold induces. He wore a dressing-gown, the pockets of which bulged with handkerchiefs. "You oughtn't to be out here, Stephen," said his wife. "Nonsense," he said. "Why, upon my soul, this steam heat is warmer than the dining-room fire." Vera, silenced by the voice of truth, could not reply. Stephen bent his great height to inspect the package. It was an appetizing Christmas package. Straw escaped from between its ribs, and it had an air of being filled with something at once large and delicate. "Oh," observed Stephen humorously. "Ah, so this is it, is it? Oh, very good." And he walked round it. How on earth had he learnt that she had bought it? She had not mentioned the purchase to Mr. Woodruff. "Yes, Stephen," she said timidly, "that's it, and I hope—" "It ought to hold a tidy few cigars, that ought," remarked Stephen complacently. He took it for the cigar cabinet. She paused, struck. She had to make up her mind in an instant. "Oh, yes," she murmured. "1,000? Yes, 1,000," she said. "I thought so," murmured Stephen. "I mustn't kiss you because I've got a cold," said he. "But all the same, I'm awfully obliged, Vera. Suppose we have it opened now, eh? Then we could decide where it is to go, and I could put my cigars in it." "Oh, no," she protested. "Oh, no, Stephen. That's not fair. It mustn't be opened before Christmas morning." "But I gave you my vases yesterday." "That's different," she said. "Christmas is Christmas." "Oh, very well," he yielded. "That's all right, my dear." Then he began to sniff. "There's a deuced odd smell from it," he said. "Perhaps it's the wood," she faltered. "I hope it isn't," he said. "I expect it's the straw. A deuced odd smell. We'll have the thing put in the side hall next to the clock. It will be out of the way there, and I can come and gaze at it when I feel depressed. Eh, Maria?" He was undoubtedly charmed at the prospect of owning so large and precious a cigar cabinet. Considering that the parcel which she had given to Peckham to put in the music stool comprised half a pound of Bostic's very ripest Gorgonzola cheese, bought at the cook's special request, the smell which proceeded from the mysterious inwards of the packing-case did not surprise Vera at all, but it disconcerted her none the less, and she wondered how she could get the cheese out. For 30 hours the smell from the unopened packing-case waxed in vigor and strength. Stephen's cold grew worse and prevented him from appreciating its full beauty, but he savoured enough of it to induce him to compare it facetiously to the effluvium of a dead rat, and he said several times that Bostic's really ought to use better straw. He was frequently to be seen in the hall, gloating over his cigar cabinet. Once he urged Vera to have it opened, and so get rid of the straw. But she refused, and found the nerve to tell him that he was exaggerating the odor. She was at a loss what to do. She could not get up in the middle of the night and unpack the package and hide its guilty secret. Indeed, to unpack the package would bring about her ruin instantly, for the package unpacked, Stephen would naturally expect to see the cigar cabinet, and so the hours crept on to Christmas, and Vera's undoing. She gave herself a headache. It was just 30 hours after the arrival of the package when Mr. Woodruff dropped in for tea. Stephen was asleep in the dining-room, which apartment he particularly affected during his colds. Woodruff was shown into the drawing-room, where Vera was having her headache. Vera brightened. In fact, she suddenly grew very bright, and she gave Woodruff tea, and took some herself, and Woodruff passed an enjoyable 20 minutes. The 2 Venetian vases were on the mantelpiece. Vera rose into ecstasy about them, and called upon Charlie Woodruff to rise too. He got up from his chair to examine the vases, which Vera had placed close together, side by side, at the corner of the mantelpiece nearest to him. Vera and Woodruff stood close together, side by side, and just as Woodruff was about to handle the vases, Vera knocked his arm. His arm collided with one vase, that vase collided with the other, and both fell to earth, to the hard, unfeeling, unyielding tiles of the hearth. 4. They were smashed to atoms. Vera screamed. She screamed twice, and ran out of the room. "Stephen! Stephen!" she cried hysterically. "Charlie has broken my vases, both of them. It is too bad of him. He's really too clumsy." There was a terrific pother. Stephen wakened violently, and in a moment all 3 were staring ineffectually at the 1,000 crystal fragments on the hearth. "But—" began Charlie Woodruff, and that was all he did say. He and Vera and Stephen had been friends since infancy, so she had the right not to conceal her feelings before him. Stephen had the same right, and they both exercised it. "But—" began Charlie again. "Oh, never mind," Stephen stopped him curtly. "Accidents can't be helped." "I shall get another pair," said Woodruff. "No, you won't," replied Stephen. "You can't. There isn't another pair in the world. See?" The two men simultaneously perceived that Vera was weeping. She was very pretty in tears, but that did not prevent the masculine world from feeling awkward and self-conscious. Charlie had notions about going out and burying himself. "Come, Vera, come," her husband enjoined, blowing his nose with unnecessary energy, bad as his cold was. I like those vases more than anything you've ever given me," Vera blubbered, charmingly, patting her eyes. Stephen glanced at Woodruff, as who would say, "Well, my boy, you uncorked those tears. I'll leave you to deal with them. You see, I'm an invalid in a dressing-gown. I leave you." And went. "No, but look here, I say," Charlie Woodruff expostulated to Vera when he was alone with her. He often started an expostulation with that singular phrase, "I'm awfully sorry. I don't know how it happened. You must let me give you something else." Vera shook her head. "Oh, no," she said. "I wanted Stephen awfully to give me that music stool that I told you about a fortnight ago, but he gave me the vases instead, and I like them ever so much better." "I shall give you the music stool. If you wanted it a fortnight ago, you want it now. It won't make up for the vases, of course, but—" "Oh, no," said Vera positively. "Why not?" "I do not wish you to give me anything. It wouldn't be quite nice," Vera insisted. "But I give you something every Christmas." "Oh, do you?" asked Vera innocently. "Yes, and you and Stephen give me something. Besides, Stephen doesn't quite like the music stool." "What's that got to do with it? You like it. I'm giving it to you, not to him. I shall go over to Bostic's tomorrow morning and get it." "I forbid you to." "I shall." Woodruff departed. Within 5 minutes the Cheserding coachman was driving off in the dog-cart to Hambridge, with the packing-case in the back of the cart and a note. He brought back the cigar-cabinet. Stephen had not stirred from the dining-room, afraid to encounter a tearful wife. Presently his wife came into the dining-room, bearing the vast load of the cigar-cabinet in her delicate arms. "I thought it might amuse you to fill it with your cigars, just to pass the time," she said. Stephen's thought was, "Well, women take the cake." It was a thought that occurs frequently to husbands of Vera's. There was ripe gorgonzola at dinner. Stephen met it as one meets a person whom one fancies one has met somewhere, but cannot remember where. The next afternoon the music stool came, for the second time, into the house. Charlie brought it in his dog-cart. It was unpacked ostentatiously by the radiant Vera. What could Stephen say in depreciation of this gift from their oldest and best friend? As a fact, he could and did say a great deal. But he said it when he happened to be all alone in the drawing-room, and had observed the appalling way in which the music stool did not go with the Chippendale. "Look at the damn thing!" he exclaimed to himself. "Look at it!" However, the Christmas dinner-party was a brilliant success, and after it Vera sat on the Art Nouveau music stool and twittered songs, and what with her being so attractive and bird-like, and what with the Christmas feeling in the air, well, Stephen resigned himself to the music stool. End of Part 6. Part 7 of A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 7, Vera's Second Christmas Adventure from The Grim Smile of the Five Towns, 1907, by Arnold Bennett. Vera's Second Christmas Adventure 1. Curious and strange things had a way of happening to Vera, perhaps because she was an extremely feminine woman. But of all the curious and strange things that ever did happen to Vera, this was certainly the strangest and the most curious. It makes a somewhat exasperating narrative, because the affair ended, or rather Vera caused it to end, on a note of interrogation. The reader may, however, draw consolation from the fact that if he is tormented by an unanswerable query, Vera herself was much more tormented by precisely the same query. 2 days before Christmas, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just when it was getting dusk, and the distant smoke pall of the Five Towns was merging in the general grayness of the northern sky, Vera was sitting in the bow window of the drawing-room of Stephen Chaucerdine's newly acquired house at Sneed. Sneed being the fashionable suburb of the Five Towns, graced by the near presence of a countess. And as the slim, 30-year-old Vera sat there, moody, for reasons which will soon appear, in her charming tea-gown, her husband drove up to the door in the dog-cart, and he was not alone. He had with him a man of vigorous and dashing appearance, fair, far from ugly, and with a masterful face, keen eyes, and most magnificent furs round about him. At sight of the visitor, Vera's heart did not exactly jump, but it nearly jumped. Presently Stephen brought his acquaintance into the drawing-room. "My wife," said Stephen, rubbing his hands. "Vera, this is Mr. Bittinger of New York. He will give us the pleasure of spending the night here." And now Vera's little heart really did jump. She behaved with the delicious wayward grace which she could always command when she chose to command it. No one would have guessed that she had not spoken to Stephen for a week. "I'm most happy, said Mr. Bittinger, with a marked accent and a fine complimentary air. And obviously he was most happy. Vera had impressed him. There was nothing surprising in that. She was in the fullness of her powers in that direction. It is at this point of the first jumping of Vera's heart, that the tale begins to be uncanny and disturbing. Thus runs the explanation. During the year, Stephen had gradually grown more and more preoccupied with the subject of his own health. The earthenware business was very good, although, of course, manufacturers were complaining just as usual. Trade, indeed, flourished to such an extent that Stephen had pronounced himself to be suffering from nervous strain and overwork. The symptoms of his malady were chiefly connected with the assimilation of food. To be brief, it was dyspepsia. And as Stephen had previously been one of those favored people who can eat anything at any hour and arise in the best of health the next day, Stephen was troubled. At last, about August, when he was obliged to give up wine, he had suddenly decided that the grimy air of the Five Towns was bad for him, and that the household should be removed to Sneed. And removed to Sneed it accordingly was. The new house was larger and more splendid even than the Cheserdine abode at Bursley. But Vera did not like the change. Vera preferred the town. Nevertheless, she could not openly demur, since Stephen's health was supposed to be at stake. During the autumn she was tremendously bored at Sneed. She had practically no audience for her pretty dresses, and her friends would not flock over from Bursley because of the difficulty of getting home at night. Then it was that Vera had the beautiful idea of spending Christmas in Switzerland. Someone had told her about a certain hotel called the Bear, where on Christmas Day never less than 100 well-dressed and wealthy English people sat down to an orthodox Christmas dinner. The notion enchanted her. She decided definitely that she and Stephen should do their Christmasing at the Bear, wherever the Bear was. And as she was fully aware of the power of her capricious charm over Stephen, she regarded the excursion as arranged before she had broached it to him. Stephen refused. He remarked bitterly that the very thought of a minced tart made him ill, and that he hated abroad. Vera took her defeat badly. She pouted. She sulked. She announced that if she was not to be allowed to do her Christmasing at the Bear, she would not do it anywhere. She indicated that she meant to perish miserably of ennui in the besotted dullness of Sneed, and that no Christmas party of any kind should occur in her house. She ceased to show interest in Stephen's health. She would not speak. In fact, she went too far. One day, in reply to her rude silence, Stephen said, "Very well, child, if that's your game, I'll play it with you. Except when other people are present, not a word do I speak to you until you have first spoken to me." She knew he would abide by that. He was a monster. She hated him. She loathed him. So she said to herself. That night, in the agony of her distress, she had dreamed a dream. She dreamed that a stranger came to the house. The details were vague, but the stranger had traveled many miles over water. She could not see him distinctly, but she knew that he was quite bald. In spite of his baldness, he inspired her with sympathy. He understood her, praised her costumes, and treated a woman as a woman ought to be treated. Then, somehow or other, he was making love to her, the monster Stephen being absent. She was shocked by his making love to her, and she moved a little farther off him on the sofa. He had sat down by her on a vague sort of sofa in a vague sort of room. But still she was thrilled, and she could not feel as wicked as she felt she ought to feel. Then the dream became hazy. It became hazy at the interesting point of her answer to the love-making. A later stage was very clear. Something was afoot between the monster Stephen and the stranger in the dining-room, and she was locked out of the dining-room. It was Christmas night. She knocked frantically at the door, and at last forced it open, and Stephen was lying in the middle of the floor. The table had been pushed into a corner. "I killed him quite by accident," said the stranger affably, and then he seized her by the hand and ruthlessly dragged her away. Away! Away! And they traveled in trains and ships and trains, and they came to a very noisy, clanging sort of city. And Vera woke up. It had been a highly realistic dream, and it made a deep impression on Vera. Can one wonder that Vera's heart, being a superstitious little heart, like all our hearts, should leap when the very next day Stephen turned up with a completely unexpected stranger from New York? Of course, dreams are nonsense. Of course. Still... She did not know whether to rejoice or mourn over the fact that Mr. Bittinger was not bald. He was decidedly unbald. He had a glorious shock of chestnut hair. That hair of his naturally destroyed any possible connection with the dream. None the less, the coincidence was bizarre. 2. That evening, before dinner, Vera, very busy in her chamber beautifying her charms for the ravishment of men from New York, waited with secret anxiety for the arrival of Stephen in his dressing-room. And whereas she usually closed the door between the bedroom and the dressing-room, on this occasion she carefully left it wide open. Stephen came at last, and she waited, listening to his movements in the dressing-room. Not a word. She made brusque movements in the bedroom to attract his attention. She even dropped a brush on the floor. Not a word. After a few moments she actually ventured into the dressing-room. Stephen was wiping his face, and he glanced at her momentarily over the towel, which hid his nose and mouth. Not a word. And how hard was the monster's glance! She felt that Stephen was one of your absurd, literal persons. He had said that he would not speak to her until she had first spoken to him. That was to say, in private. Public performances did not count. And he would stick to his text, no matter how deliciously she behaved. She left the dressing-room in haste. Very well, very well. If Stephen wished for war, he should have it. Her grievance against him grew into something immense. Before, it had been nothing but a kind of two-roomed cottage. She now erected it into a town hall, with imposing portals and many windows and rich statuary, and suite after suite of enormous rooms, and marble staircases, and lifts that went up and down. She wished she had never married him. She wished that Mr. Bittinger had been bald. At dinner everything went with admirable smoothness. Mr. Bittinger sat betwixt them, and utmost politeness reigned. In their quality of well-bred hosts, they both endeavored to keep Mr. Bittinger at his ease, despite their desolating quarrel, and they entirely succeeded. As the champagne disappeared, and it was not Stephen that drank it, Mr. Bittinger became more than at his ease. He was buyer for an important firm of earthenware dealers in New York. Vera had suspected as much. These hospitalities to American buyers are an essential part of business in the Five Towns, and he related very drolly the series of chances, or mischances, that had left him stranded in England at that season, so unseasonable for buying. Vera reflected upon the series of chances, or mischances, and upon her dream of the man from over the long miles of water. Of course, dreams are nonsense. But still... The conversation passed to the topic of Stephen's health, as conversations in Stephen's house had a habit of doing. Mr. Bittinger listened with grave interest. "Oh, I know," said Mr. Bittinger. "I used to be exactly the same. I guess I understand how you feel, don't I?" "And you are cured?" Stephen demanded eagerly, as he nibbled at dry toast. "You bet I'm cured," said Mr. Bittinger. "You must tell me about that," said Stephen, and added, "some time tonight." He did not care to discuss the bewildering internal economy of the human frame at his dinner table. There were details, and Mr. Bittinger was in a mood that it was no exaggeration to describe as gay. Shortly afterwards there arose a discussion as to their respective ages. They coquetted for a few moments, as men invariably will, each diffident about giving away the secret, each asserting that the other was younger than himself. "Well," said Mr. Bittinger to Vera at length, "what age should you give me?" I should give you 5 years less than Stephen," Vera replied. "And may I ask how old you are?" Mr. Bittinger put the question at close range to Stephen, and hit him full in the face with it. "I'm 40," said Stephen. "So am I," said Mr. Bittinger. "Well, you don't look it," said Stephen. "Sure," Mr. Bittinger admitted, pleased. "My husband's hair is turning gray," said Vera, "while yours—" "Turning gray!" exclaimed Mr. Bittinger. "I wish mine was. I'd give $5,000 today if mine was." "But why?" Vera smiled. "Look here, my dear lady," said Mr. Bittinger in a peculiar voice, putting down his glass, and with a swift movement he lifted a wig of glorious chestnut hair from his head, just lifted it for an instant and dropped it. The man was utterly and completely bald. 3. Vera did nothing foolish. She neither cried, screamed, turned deadly pale, clenched her fragile hands, bit her lips till the blood came, smashed a wineglass, nor fell with a dull thud senseless to the floor. Nevertheless, she was extremely perturbed by this astounding revelation of Mr. Bittinger's. Of course, dreams are nonsense, but still... The truth is, one tries to believe that dreams are nonsense, and up to a certain point one may succeed in believing. But it seemed to Vera that circumstances had passed that point. She could not but admit also that if the dream went on being fulfilled, within 48 hours Mr. Bittinger would have made love to her and would have killed her husband. She was so incensed against Stephen that she really could not decide whether she wanted the dream to be fulfilled or not. No one would have imagined that that soft breast could conceal a homicidal thought. Yet so it was. That pretty and delightful woman, wandering about in the edifice of her terrific grievance against Stephen, could not say positively to herself that she would not care to have Stephen killed as a punishment for his sins. After dinner she found an excuse for retiring. She must think the puzzle out in solitude. Matters were really going too far. She allowed it to be understood that she was indisposed. Mr. Bittinger was full of sorrow and sympathy. But did Stephen show the slightest concern? Stephen did not. She went upstairs, and she meditated, stretched on the sofa at the foot of the bed, a rug over her knees and the fire glinting on her face. Yes, it was her duty as a Christian, if not as an outraged wife, to warn Stephen that the shadow of death was creeping up behind him. He ought at least to be warned. But how could she warn him? Clearly she could not warn him in the presence of Mr. Bittinger, the prospective murderer. She would, therefore, have to warn him when they were alone, and that meant that she would have to give way in the great conjugal sulking match. No, never. It was impossible that she should give way there. She frowned desperately at the leaping flames, and did ultimately decide that Stephen's death was preferable to her defeat in that contest. Of such is human nature. After all, dreams are nonsense. Surely Stephen would come upstairs to inquire about her health, her indisposition. But no, he came not. And as he continued not to come, she went downstairs again and proclaimed that she was better. And then she learned that she had been worrying herself to no purpose whatever. Mr. Bittinger was leaving on the morrow being Christmas Eve. Stephen would drive him to Burley in the morning. He would go to the Five Towns Hotel to get his baggage and catch the Liverpool express at noon. He had booked a passage on the Saxonia, which sailed at 3:30 o'clock. Thus he would spend his Christmas at sea, and spending his Christmas at sea, he could not possibly kill Stephen in the village of Sneed on Christmas night. Relief, and yet a certain vague regret in the superstitious little heart. The little heart went to bed again, and Stephen and the stranger stayed up talking very late, doubtless about the famous cure. The leave-taking the next morning increased the vague regret. Mr. Bittinger was the possessor of an attractive individuality, and Vera pondered upon its attractiveness far into the afternoon. How nicely Mr. Bittinger had thanked her for her gracious hospitality, with what meaning he had charged the expression of his deep regret at leaving her. After all, dreams were nonsense. She was sitting in the bow window of the drawing-room, precisely as she had been sitting 24 hours previously, when whom should she see striding masculinely along the drive towards the house but Mr. Bittinger. This time she was much more perturbed, even than she had been by the revelation of Mr. Bittinger's baldness. After all... She uprose, the blood having rushed to her head, and retreated she knew not whither, blindly, without a purpose, and found herself in a little morning-room, which was scarcely ever used, at the end of the hall. She had not shut the door, and Mr. Bittinger, having been admitted by a servant, caught sight of her, and breezily entered her retreat, clad in his magnificent furs. And as he doffed the furs, he gaily told her what had happened. Owing to difficulties with the Cheserdine mare on the frosty undulating road between Sneed and Bursley, and owing to delays with his baggage at the Five Towns Hotel, he had just missed the Liverpool express, and therefore the steamer also. He had returned to Stephen's manufactory. Stephen had insisted that he should spend his Christmas with them, and in brief, there he was. He had walked from Bursley. Stephen, kept by business, was coming later, and so was some of the baggage. Mr. Bittinger's face radiated joy. The loss of his 20-guinea passage on the Saxonia did not appear to cause him the least regret. And he sat down by the side of Vera. And Vera suddenly noticed that they were on a sofa, the sofa of her dream, and she fancied she recognized the room. "You know, my dear lady," said Mr. Bittinger, looking her straight in the eyes, "I'm just glad I missed my steamer. It gives me a chance to spend a Christmas in England, and in your delightful society. Your delightful society." He gazed at her, without adding to the sentence. If this was not love-making on a sofa, what could be? Mr. Bittinger had certainly missed the Liverpool express on purpose. Of that Vera was convinced. Or, if he had not missed it on purpose, he had missed it under the dictates of the mysterious power of the dream. Those people who chose to believe that dreams are nonsense were at liberty to do so. 4. So that, in spite of Vera's definite proclamation that there should be no Christmasing in her house that year, Christmasing there emphatically was. Impossible to deny anything to Mr. Bittinger. Mr. Bittinger wanted holly, the gardener supplied it. Mr. Bittinger wanted mistletoe, a bunch of it was brought home by Stephen in the dog-cart. Mr. Bittinger could not conceive an English Christmas without turkey, mince pies, plum pudding, and all the usual indigestiveness. Vera, speaking in a voice which seemed somehow not to be hers, stated that these necessaries of Christmas life would be produced, and Stephen did not say that the very thought of a mince tart made him ill. Even the English weather, which, it is notorious, has of late shown a sad disposition to imitate and even to surpass in mildness the weather of the Riviera at Christmas, decided to oblige Mr. Bittinger. At nightfall on Christmas Eve it began to snow gently but steadily, fine frozen snow, and the Waits, consisting of boys and girls from the Countess of Shell's celebrated institute close by, came and sang in the garden in the falling snow, by the light of a lantern, and Mr. Bittinger's heart was as full as it could hold of English Christmas. As for Vera's heart, it was full of she knew not what. Mr. Bittinger's attitude towards her grew more and more chivalrous. He contrived to indicate that he regarded all the years he had spent before making the acquaintance of Vera as so many years absolutely wasted, and Stephen did not seem to care. They retired to rest that evening up a staircase whose banisters the industrious hands of Mr. Bittinger had entwined with holly and paper festoons, and bade each other a Merry Christmas with immense fervor. But in the conjugal chamber Stephen maintained his policy of implacable silence, and naturally Vera maintained hers. Could it be expected of her that she should yield? The fault was all Stephen's. He ought to have taken her to the Bear, Switzerland. Then there would have been no dream, no Mr. Bittinger, and no danger. But as things were, within 24 hours he would be a dead man. And throughout Christmas Day, Vera, beneath the gaiety with which she met the vivacious sallies of Mr. Bittinger, waited in horrible suspense for the dream to fulfill itself. Stephen alone observed her agitated condition. Stephen said to himself, "The quarrel is getting on her nerves. She'll yield before she's a day older. It will do her good. Then I'll make it up to her handsomely. But she must yield first." He little knew he was standing on the edge of the precipice of death. The Christmas dinner succeeded admirably, and Stephen, in whom courage was seldom lacking, ate half a mince pie. The day was almost over. No premature decease had so far occurred, and when both the men said that if Vera permitted, they would come with her at once to the drawing-room and smoke there, Vera decided that after all, dreams were nonsense. She entered the drawing-room first, and Mr. Bittinger followed her, with Stephen behind. But just as Stephen was crossing the mat, the gardener, holding a parcel in his hands and looking rather strange there in the hall, spoke to him, and Stephen stopped and called to Mr. Bittinger, and the drawing-room door was closed upon Vera. She waited, solitary, for an incredible space of time, and then, having heard unaccustomed and violent sounds in the distance, she could contain herself no longer, and she rang the bell. "Louisa," she demanded of the parlour-maid, "where is your master?" "Oh, ma'am," replied Louisa, giggling. A little license was surely permissible to the girl on Christmas night. "Oh, ma'am, there's such a to-do. Tinsley has just brought some boxing gloves, and Master and Mr. Bittinger have got their coats off in the dining-room, and they've had the table pushed up by the door, and you never saw such a set-out in all your life, ma'am." Vera dismissed Louisa. There it was, the dream. They were going to box. Mr. Bittinger was doubtless an expert, and she knew that Stephen was not. A chance blow by Mr. Bittinger in some vital part, and Stephen would be lying stretched in eternal stillness in the middle of the dining-room floor, where the table ought to be. The life of the monster was at stake. The life of the brute was in her hands. The dream was fulfilling itself to the point of tragedy. She jumped up and rushed to the dining-room door. It would not open. Again the dream. "You can't come in," cried Stephen, laughing. "Wait a bit." She pushed against the door, working the handle. She was about to insist upon the door being opened when the idea of the danger of such a proceeding occurred to her. In the dream, when she got the door opened, her husband's death had already happened. Frantically, she ran to the kitchen. "Louisa," she ordered, "go into the garden and tap at the dining-room window, and tell your master that I must speak to him at once in the drawing-room." And, in a pitiable state of excitation, she returned to the drawing-room. After another interminable period of suspense, her ear caught the sound of the opening of doors, and then Stephen came into the drawing-room. A singular apparition! He was coatless, as Louisa had said, and the extremities of his long arms were bulged out with cream-colored boxing gloves. She sprang at him and kissed him. "Steve," she said, "are we friends?" "I should think we were," he replied, returning her kiss heartily. He had won. "What are you doing?" she asked him. "Bittinger and I are just going to have a real round with the gloves. It's part of his cure for my indigestion, you know. He says there's nothing like it. I've only just been able to get gloves. Tinsley brought them up just now, and so we sort of thought we'd like to have a go at once." "Why wouldn't you let me into the dining-room?" "My child, the table was up against the door, and I fancied perhaps you wouldn't be exactly charmed, so I—" "Stephen," she said in her most persuasive voice, "will you do something to please me?" "What is it?" "Will you?" A pause. "Yes, certainly." "Don't box tonight." "Oh, well, what will Bittinger think?" Another pause. "Never mind. You don't want me to box, really?" "I don't want you to box. Not tonight." "Agreed, my chuck?" And he kissed her again. He could well afford to be magnanimous. Mr. Bittinger plowed the seas alone to New York. But supposing that Vera had not interfered, what would have happened? That is the unanswerable query which torments the superstitious little brain of Vera. End of Part 7. Part 8 of A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 8, 12 Christmas Verses from Dreams and Images, 1917, edited by Joyce Kilmer. 1. A Christmas Song by Teresa Brayton. O Lord, as you lay so soft and white, a babe in a manger stall, with the big star flashing across the night, did you know and pity us all? Did the wee hands, close as a rosebud curled, with the call of their mission ache to be out and saving a weary world for your merciful Father's sake? Did you hear the cries of the groping blind, the woe of the leper's prayer, the surging sorrow of all mankind, as you lay by your mother there? Beyond the shepherds, low bending down, the long, long road did you see that led from peaceful Bethlehem town to the summit of Calvary? The world, grown weary of wasting strife, had called for the Christ to rise, for sin had poisoned the springs of life, and only the dead were wise. But, wrapped in a dream of scornful pride, too high were its eyes to see a child foredoomed to be crucified on a peasant mother's knee. But while the heavens with glad acclaim sang out the tale of your birth, a mystic echo of comfort came to the desolate souls of earth. For the thrill of a slowly turning tide was felt in that gray daybreak, as if God the Father had sanctified all sorrow for one man's sake. O child of the promise, Lord of love, O Master of all the earth, while the angels are singing their songs above, we bring our gifts to your birth. Just the blind man's cry, and the lame man's pace, and the leper's pitiful call, on these, over infinite fields of space, look down, for you know them all. 2. The Angelic Chorus by D.J. Donahoe. At midnight from the zenith burst a light more radiant and more beautiful than dawn, and the meek shepherds on the shadowy lawn gazed upward in mute wonder on the sight. The stars sank back in pallor, and the skies trembled responsive to rich harmonies. And lo, an angel spake, "Be not afraid, I bear glad tidings, for this happy morn a Saviour and a King to man is born. He sleepeth in a manger lowly laid." Then rolled along the heavens the glad refrain, "Glory to God on high, and peace to men." Soon from the skies the streaming light was gone, and night and silence rested on the hill. But the mute shepherds, looking upward still, could hear the heavenly echoes rolling on. So evermore the listening world can hear the angelic chorus singing sweet and clear. 3. Yuletide by Alice Furlong. In a stable bare, lo, the great ones are. Strew the ivy and the myrtle round the Virgin's kirtle. Ass and oxen mild breathe soft upon the child. Blow the scent of bygone summer on your breath to the new comer. Be ye well content to be straitly pent backwards in the rocky chamber from the angel's wings of amber. Wrapped the seraphs sit, with the godly faces lit, in a radiance shining solely from the Christ-child, meek and holy. High they chant, and clear of the lovely cheer ring down the new evangels of the mystic midnight angels. Faring with good will from the mystic hill, every shepherd sacrificeth to the prophet that ariseth. Joseph, Mary's spouse, Prince of David's house, bendeth low in adoration to the ruler of the nations, who doth sweetly rest on his mother's breast. Lord of the lightnings and the thunders, Mary's heart keeps all these wonders. 4. Tryste, Noel, by Louise Imogen Guiney. The ox he openeth wide the door, and from the snow he calls her in, and he hath seen her smile therefore, Our Lady without sin. Now soon from sleep a star shall leap, and Son arrive, both King and Hind. Amen, amen, but oh the place could I but find! The ox hath hushed his voice, and bent true eyes of pity o'er the mow, and on his lovely neck forspent the Blessed lays her brow. Around her feet, full warm and sweet, his bowery breath doth meekly dwell. Amen, amen, but sore am I with vain travail. The ox is host in Judah's stall, and host of more than only one, for close she gathereth withal our Lord her little Son. Glad Hind and King their gift may bring, but woe to-night my tears were there. Amen, amen, between her bosom and his hair. 5. King Arthur's Waes-Hael, by Robert Stephen Hawker. Waes-Hael for knight and dame, O merry be their dole. Drink hael, in Jesu's name we fill the tawny bowl. But cover down the curving crest, mould of the Orient lady's breast. Waes-Hael, yet lift no lid, drain ye the reeds for wine. Drink hael, the milk was hid that soothed that babe divine. Hushed as this hollow channel flows, he drew the balsam from the rose. Waes-Hael, thus glowed the breast where a God yearned to cling. Drink hael, so Jesu pressed life from its mystic spring. Then hush and bend in reverend sign, and breathe the thrilling reeds for wine. Waes-Hael, in shadowy scene, lo, Christmas children we. Drink hael, behold we lean at a far mother's knee, to dream that thus her bosom smiled, and learn the lip of Bethlehem's child. 6. Christmas and Ireland, by Lionel Johnson. The golden stars give warmthless fire as weary Mary goes through night. Her feet are torn by stone and briar, she hath no rest, no strength, no light. O Mary, weary in the snow, remember Ireland's woe. O Joseph, sad for Mary's sake, look on our earthly mother too. Let not the heart of Ireland break with agony the ages through. For Mary's love, love also thou Ireland, and save her now. Harsh were the folk and bitter stern at Bethlehem that night of nights. For you no cheering hearth shall burn, we have no room here, you no rights. O Mary and Joseph, hath not she, Ireland, been even as ye? The ancient David's royal house was thine, Saint Joseph, wherefore she, Mary, thine ever-virgin spouse, to thine own city went with thee. Behold, thy citizens disown the heir of David's throne. Nay more, the very King of kings was with you, coming to his own. They thrust him forth to lowliest things. The poor meek beasts of toil alone stood by, when came to piteous birth the God of all the earth. And she, our mother Ireland, knows insult and infamies of wrong, her innocent children clad with woes, her weakness trampled by the strong, and still upon her holy land her pitiless foemen stand. From manger unto cross and crown went Christ, and Mother Mary passed through 7 sorrows, and sat down upon the angel throne at last. Thence, Mary, to thine own child pray for Ireland's hope this day. She wanders amid winter still, the dew of tears is on her face. Her wounded heart takes yet its fill of desolation and disgrace. God still is God, and through God she foreknows her joy to be. The snows shall perish at the spring, and flowers pour fragrance round her feet. Ah, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, bring this mercy from the mercy seat. Send it, sweet King of glory born, humbly on Christmas morn. 7. Unto us a Son is given, by Alice Meynell. Given, not lent, and not withdrawn, once sent, this infant of mankind, this one, is still the little welcome Son. New every year, new born and newly dear, he comes with tidings and a song, the ages long, the ages long. Even as the cold, keen winter grows not old, as childhood is so fresh foreseen, and spring in the familiar green, sudden as sweet comes the expected feet, all joy is young, and new all art, and he too, whom we have by heart. 8. The Son of God, by Charles L. O'Donnell, C.Sc. The fount of Mary's joy revealed now lies, for lo, has not the boy his father's eyes? 9. A Christmas Carol, by Mary A. O'Reilly. Night in the far Judean land, the pregnant air is still. The sky, one blue, unclouded band, seems drooping o'er each hill. The hills, then, toward each other bend, some mighty secret to portend, Gloria in excelsis Deo. The sheep in nearby pastures browse, some bleat as if in pain. The youthful shepherds watch and drowse, then drowse and watch again. When lo, a light from heaven appears, which makes them huddle in their fears, Gloria in excelsis Deo. God's glory shone around them there, and then an angel cried, Fear not, for I good tidings bear to you and all beside. For unto you is born this day a Saviour, Christ the Lord. We pray, Gloria in excelsis Deo. Then swinging from the skies there came groups of the heavenly host, praising the Lord in sweet acclaim, the burden of their toast, Glory to God on high again, His peace on earth, good will to men, Gloria in excelsis Deo. Within a stable sweet with hay and warm with breath of kine, the baby and his mother lay, O mystery divine! The bed of straw a cloud appears, we hear the music of the spheres, Gloria in excelsis Deo. Dear maiden mother, let us now, while to your breast he clings, in humble adoration bow with shepherds and with kings, and at his feet our offering be praise, love, faith, hope, and charity. Gloria in excelsis Deo. 10. Mary's Baby by Shamus O'Shiel. Joseph, mild and noble, bent above the straw. A pale girl, a frail girl, suffering he saw. "O my love, my Mary, my bride, I pity thee." "Nay, dear," said Mary, "all is well with me." "Baby, my baby, oh my baby," she sang. Suddenly the golden night all with music rang. Angels leading shepherds, shepherds leading sheep, the silence of worship broke the mother's sleep. All the meek and lowly of the world were there. Smiling, she showed them that her child was fair. "Baby, my baby," kissing him she said. Suddenly a flaming star through the heavens sped. 3 old men and weary knelt them side by side, the world's wealth forswearing, majesty and pride, worldly might and wisdom before the baby bent low. Weeping, Maid Mary said, "Oh, I love him so." "Baby, my baby," and the baby slept. Suddenly on Calvary all the olives wept. 11. The Babe of Bethlehem by Conde Benoist Palen. O cruel manger, how bleak, for the limbs of the babe, my God, soft little limbs on the cold, cold straw. Weep, O eyes, for thy God. Bitter ye winds in the frosty night upon the babe, my God, piercing the torn and broken thatch. Lament, O heart, for thy God. Bare is the floor, how bare, for the babe's sweet mother, my God. Only a stable for mother and babe, how cruel thy world, my God. Cast out, by his brother men, unknown the babe, my God. The ox and the ass alone are there. Soften, O heart, for thy God. Dear little arms and sweet little hands that stretch for thy mother, my God. Soft baby eyes to the mother's eyes, melt, O heart, for thy God. Waxen touches on mother's heart, fingers of the babe, my God. Dear baby lips to her virgin breast, the Virgin Mother of God. The shepherds have come from the hills to adore the babe in the manger, my God. Mary and Joseph welcome them there. Worship, O soul, thy God. But I alone may not come near the babe in the manger, my God. Weep for thy sins, O heart, and plead with Mary, the Mother of God. May I not come, O just to the door, to see the babe, my God? There will I stop and kneel and adore, and weep for my sins, O God. But Mary smiles, and rising up, in her arms the babe, my God, she comes to the door and bends her down, with the babe in her arms, my God. Her sinless arms in my sinful arms place the baby, my God. He has come to take thy sins away. Break, O heart, for thy God. 12. Le Repos in Egypte, the Sphynx, by Agnes Repplier. All day I watch the stretch of burning sand. All night I brood beneath the golden stars. Amid the silence of a desolate land, no touch of bitterness my reverie mars. Built by the proudest of a kingly line, over my head the centuries fly fast. The secrets of the mighty dead are mine. I hold the key of a forgotten past. Yet, ever hushed into a rapturous dream, I see again that night. A halo mild shone from the liquid moon. Beneath her beam travelled a tired young mother and the child. Within mine arms she slumbered, and alone I watched the infant. At my feet her guide lay stretched, o'er-wearied. On my breast of stone rested the crucified. End of Part 8. Part 9 of A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 9, 4 Christmas Carols by Christina Rosetti. First Carol. Whoso hears a chiming for Christmas at the nighest, hears a sound like angels chanting in their glee, hears a sound like palm boughs waving in the highest, hears a sound like ripple of a crystal sea. Sweeter than a prayer bell for a saint in dying, sweeter than a death bell for a saint at rest. Music struck in heaven, with earth's faint replying, life is good and death is good, for Christ is best. Second Carol. A holy heavenly chime rings fullness in of time, and on his mother's breast, our Lord God ever blessed, is laid a babe at rest. Stoop, spirits unused to stoop, swoop, angels flying swoop, adoring as you gaze, uplifting hymns of praise, grace to the full of grace. The cave is cold and strait to hold the angelic state, more strait it is, more cold, to foster and enfold its Maker, 1 hour old. Thrilled through with awe-struck love, meek angels poised above, to see their God look down. What, is there never a crown for him in swaddled gown? How comes he soft and weak, with such a tender cheek, with such a soft small hand, the very hand which spanned heaven when its girth was planned? How comes he with a voice which is but baby noise, that voice which spake with might, "Let there be light," and light sprang out before our sight? What need hath he of flesh, made flawless now afresh? What need of human heart, heart that must bleed and smart, choosing the better part? But see, his gracious smile dismisses us awhile to serve him in his kin. Haste we, make haste, begin to fetch his brethren in. Like stars they flash and shoot, the shepherds they salute. Glory to God they sing, good news of peace we bring, for Christ is born a King. Third Carol. Lo, new-born Jesus, soft and weak and small, wrapped in baby's bands by his mother's hands, Lord God of all. Lord God of Mary, whom his lips caress, while he rocks to rest on her milky breast in helplessness. Lord God of shepherds, flocking through the cold, flocking through the dark, to the only ark, the only fold. Lord God of all things, be they near or far, be they high or low, Lord of storm and snow, angel and star. Lord God of all men, my Lord and my God, thou who lovest me, keep me close to thee by staff and rod. Lo, new-born Jesus, loving great and small, love's free sacrifice, opening arms and eyes to one and all. Fourth Carol. In the bleak midwinter, frosty wind made moan, earth stood hard as iron, water like a stone. Snow had fallen, snow on snow, snow on snow, in the bleak midwinter long ago. Our God, heaven cannot hold him, nor earth sustain. Heaven and earth shall flee away when he comes to reign. In the bleak midwinter a stable place sufficed, the Lord God Almighty, Jesus Christ. Enough for him whom cherubim worship night and day, a breast full of milk and a manger full of hay. Enough for him whom angels fall down before, the ox and ass and camel, which adore. Angels and archangels may have gathered there, cherubim and seraphim thronged the air, but only his mother in her maiden bliss worshipped her beloved with a kiss. What can I give him, poor as I am? If I were a shepherd, I would bring a lamb. If I were a wise man, I would do my part. Yet what I can, I give him. Give my heart. End of Part 9. End of A Christmas Miscellany 2021 by Various.